So I'd like to introduce the moderator for the next presentation and the presentation itself, but I just wanted to point out, someone and I were just talking, and sort of the comment was that we have lots to hash out here. So, okay. So the next panel focuses on the therapeutic benefit of medicinal cannabis. And as our moderator, we have a current King County Council member, Jean Cole Wells. And it's appropriate that she serve in this capacity as a moderator. She told me to keep the introduction short, so I'll refer you to the bio in the material in your folder, but I want to say a couple of things. One of which is that she said that early on in her career, she was one of the first legislators to begin raising issues and questions and maybe promoting the potential benefits of marijuana at a time when the term marijuana was verboten, essentially, in many legislative circles. And so she had the foresight and the courage at that point in time to do so. And really it was in part some of the legislative work she had done along the way that contributed to the passage of Initiative 692, which was the one in state that legalized essentially medicinal marijuana, that an individual could receive marijuana from a provider for the purposes of dealing with some kind of medical issue at that point in time. So as we look at this panel, and as we look at sort of the benefits that can be accrued from the use of medicinal cannabis, we need to give credit to our panel moderator. So I would like to introduce her to you. Jean?
Thank you, Dr. Donovan. It's really a pleasure to be here. I love being among academics and researchers. I actually taught at the University of Washington for 23 years in sociology and women's studies and education, and have a PhD in sociology. So I did research for a long period of time. And during my years in the state Senate, I was really gravitated to work on legislation having to do with the Life Sciences Discovery Board, which we started, in stem cell research and marijuana efficacy for medical uses and so forth. So I wish I could have been here this morning, but I could not. But I'm very happy to be here now. And I'm also delighted that WSU and UW researchers and other academics are here. So I was asked to just speak for a few minutes first before the panel on my experiences having to do with medical cannabis. So I will just try to give you a little thumbnail synopsis. It's hard for me to keep it short, though, when I talk about this topic. I began my efforts when I went to the Senate in 1995, and I had been mentioned in a Seattle Weekly article on the issue of medical marijuana, which it was kind of a new thing to even talk about or have the media cover. And Joanna McKee, a longtime legend of a patient advocate, had mentioned me in this, that was reported in the weekly article, and I didn't know her. And she had somehow identified me as the person who would take the lead on this issue. And I hadn't even thought about that. But I did. And I just thought, well, okay. And I'm a Democrat, and I began working with a Republican state senator from Spokane, Bob McCaslin, and he was very conservative Republican, but his wife had died recently at that time in 1996, and he understood this issue firsthand, watching his wife suffer toward the end of her life. From the ravages of chemotherapy and radiation in particular. And also, a few years before that, my sister-in-law had died of cancer in Connecticut. She was only 34 years old and left behind a 15-month-old son. And it was really horrible, just a terrible ordeal. And I found out a few years later that her conservative Republican parents in Connecticut and her husband had gone out on the streets. The husband did, not the parents, but they supported him to purchase marijuana illegally on the streets because they found that that helped her, gave her a little comfort from the radiation and chemotherapy and allowed her to eat a little bit. So we worked together, and shockingly were able to get, I think it was about 90,000, somewhere in that, in this state supplemental budget for WSU to conduct a study, basically a literature review on the efficacy of medical marijuana, as we called it at that time. And the report came back after a while, and it was inconclusive, which was kind of disappointing to me. But here we are today, still talking about whether medical cannabis is effective or not. So about the same time, a couple years later, I introduced legislation in 1998, Senate Bill 6271, that really tried to get at the heart of this, that patients who have qualifying conditions should be able, with their doctor's approval, to use medical marijuana for their condition. And at this time, I will never forget it, 1998, I was visiting Bainbridge Island every weekend because my best friend was dying from cancer. And a very brave oncologist at Swedish Hospital, and very brave because it was totally unlawful for him to do this, but he recommended to her that she try marijuana to assuage the effects of her treatment. And I saw firsthand, it was the first time I really saw this, that it worked. She could take a couple of puffs of the little cigarette and be able to drink a little soup and consume some water. So I worked on this legislation with another conservative Eastern Washington Republican, which goes to show this is not a partisan issue. Pain and suffering are not partisan. Alex Decio, and he chaired the Senate Healthcare Committee. And while I was working on this legislation, my best friend died. We were not able to get the bill through, but much of that legislation was turned into Initiative 692, which was approved by the voters that fall. Now, the flaw, in my mind, in Initiative 692 was that while it allowed for qualifying patients to be able to use medical marijuana with their doctor's recommendation, we could not then, and we still cannot now, have prescriptions, since medical marijuana is a Schedule I drug, unfortunately. But the flaw in that initiative was it did not specify what a 60-day supply would be. And that had been intentional on the part of the writers of the initiative, but it really caused a lot of, well, a huge amount of concerns, because how could a patient prove that what a 60-day supply was needed? And how was law enforcement able to really make that determination? So I worked for several years on that, and we were able to get that corrected in statute. And it was in 1990, actually 2008, we were able to do that by having the Board of Health, the State Board of Health, work with advocacy groups and physician groups and all sorts of groups to come up with what that would be. And in the meantime, I worked on another issue that I thought was really rather groundbreaking, but it didn't seem like that big of an issue at the time. And that was in Senate Bill 5798, which was enacted in 2010, and it extended the legal authority for recommending medical marijuana to qualifying patients to all healthcare professionals who have prescriptive authority. So we're talking about advanced registered nurse practitioners and naturopaths and others. So that was something that was really helpful. My huge bill, I think this was the toughest one I ever worked on in my whole time in the legislature, and I see Pete Holmes is nodding his head yes, was Senate Bill 5703 in 2011. I didn't think I'd really be able to do it, but we were able to get through the House and the Senate and all these amendments, the legislation to create a licensed system of producing, processing, and distributing, selling marijuana for medical purposes that had been documented. This was a huge thing. It was enormous. And then Governor Gregoire, bless her heart, but she vetoed most of it because she was concerned about state employees who would be processing the licensing being vulnerable for federal prosecution. It never made sense to me, and Governor Gregoire was a strong supporter of medical marijuana, but that was very, very unfortunate, and it left the legislation that remained, that wasn't vetoed, creating a huge ambiguity and mess in the whole system. The fortunate part of it was, though, that because of that, Allison Holcomb from the ACLU of Washington authored Initiative 502, which allowed for the legalization of recreational use of marijuana and the system for producing, processing, and selling that. And so I was very pleased about that. I had issues after that with it. I wasn't perfect, and here we are. One last thing, in 2015, my last session of the legislature before I resigned and am now to take the office of King County Council member, I was able to get past Senate Bill 5121, which is the first of its kind in the country, and that was to create a marijuana or cannabis research license. It was amended and so after that, it's still a struggle with this, and I'm sure this is being discussed at the conference today. But I've worked on this for 19 years, and I'm still working on some of the matters at the county council as I'm there now. But I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'd like to now go ahead and introduce our speakers. We have three panelists today, three great panelists here today, Dr. Nephi Stella, Dr. Michael Morgan, and Dr. Michelle Bedard Gilligan. And I'm going to introduce them all, but I want to let you know just the logistics here. Each presenter will have 15 minutes, which will be monitored by ADAI staff here in the first row, and we will ask presenters to note the 10, 5, and done signs, so I don't have to intervene. And we will not have questions during or even after each of the presenters' remarks. Rather, we will wait till all three are done and then have them come up to the table here, and I will go ahead and then ask questions that you, the audience members, have submitted. So, our first speaker is Dr. Nephi Stella, who is a professor in the departments of pharmacology and psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington. Do you do enough? How do you get around to everything? He was recently named director of the University of Washington Center for Cannabis Research. Dr. Stella's studies focus on the therapeutic value and molecular mechanism of action of drugs targeting the cannabinoid signaling system. You can read a more detailed presentation bio of Dr. Nephi on the handout placed in your folder. Dr. Stella's presentation title is Optimizing the Medical Properties of Cannabis from Hypothesis to Proof of Concept. Dr. Stella.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. What an honor. So here's my first slide, just to a way of background. So I am a professor in pharmacology and psychiatry behavioral science, which means that I think about the molecule, how it travels in our body, and I also think about how the molecule affects our brain functions. And over here, I have kind of the outline of my area of research. So I'm really interested, just starting from the plant, to understand how cannabinoids are produced. And one of the main protagonists that I'll be talking about is delta-9 THC. You have the chemical structure that acts on its receptors. And the two types of cell type that I'm really interested in are neurons. And the therapeutic indication is how cannabinoids can actually regulate seizure incidence. And truly, my goal is to try to understand this mechanism and develop novel therapeutics that will go all the way to humans in clinical trials. And the epilepsy topic is what I'll be focusing on today. I have a second arm in the lab that studies how cannabinoids can actually kill cancer cells. It's a very exciting area of research. They are killing cancer cells through a completely different mechanism of action. And we're trying to push this forward also all the way to clinical trials. And I have a punchline typically at the bottom of the slide, so you know what the main point is. And this is slide number 1 out of 14. So I think we'll be done in 15 minutes. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to optimize the therapeutic efficacy of a molecule. And this has been done in the past with several types of molecule. For aspirin, for example, where you extract it from a plant and then eventually you put it into a pill. And today we have a molecular or even atomic understanding of exactly how the molecule will inhibit this specific enzymes. And that's what we're trying to do with cannabinoids. This has been done with very challenging molecules, for example, with opioids. And today we have a whole panel of painkillers that are based on opioid molecules, and you're able to optimize those therapeutic processes because we have this very detailed understanding of how the molecule actually interacts with the opioid receptors. So we need to think about cannabis as a continuum of effects. There's both a vast amount of cannabis products, and this is actually driven by the legalization. And this is a continuum where there are some products that have very interesting and promising beneficial effects, very exciting harm reduction effects. I think the predominant one that we'll be talking about today is how it can help with opioids. And then there is some potential harm. So we need to think about this as a continuum and truly study each aspect of that. And the other aspect that we need to think about is that this is also changes according to time. As the opinions are changing and as our better understanding of how these molecules are working, we can actually optimize all this. So let's talk about our protagonists. So we're talking about the cannabis plant. There's actually about a decade ago, I think, it was the first American Pharmacopoeia textbook that was published that is basically a reference on what we currently know on the cannabis plant. In B, you can see the various types of strains that are typically sold with very exotic names like Blue, Foggy Mountain, or Pineapple Express, all these very strange names, actually. But truly what we understand today is that these hybrids are not very well defined, or at least were not very well defined in their composition of the molecules that they contain. And in C, you see the main bioactive ingredients, the molecules that produce the biological activity. We'll be talking about THC as well as CBD. And here I have actually the chemical structure of a synthetic cannabinoids that can be actually purchased online, for example, Spice. And what I want to emphasize is that this molecule is completely different than molecules that are produced by the plant. They have a completely different chemical structure and probably a very different safety profile. There's a lot of toxicity that can be associated to that. In D is the fact that this plant actually has a very interesting genotype. The DNA of this plant is humongous and really not well studied. So I think there's a tremendous amount of research that we need to do to better understand both the genetics, which is the DNA content, but also the chemotype of this plant, the terpenes, and all the other molecules. and eventually even the phenotype, how the plant looks. Do you want a tall plant or a shorter plant? And all of this is really in its infancy. We have maybe hundreds of papers or thousands of papers on the biology of the cannabis plants compared to millions and multi-millions of papers on the biology of apples and tomatoes. So I think there's a lot of research to be done around the plant. So what we'll be doing is we're going to be trying to develop a novel therapeutic approach. And novel is one point, but the other one is transformative. I think the idea of transformative is very important because a transformative medicine addresses a medical need that has not been solved before. There's many diseases out there that remain without therapeutic approaches, and developing a cannabis-based transformative medicine could accomplish that. So we need to think about, number one, we need a reliable source of compounds. Number two, we need a good delivery system. These are oral delivery systems. Number three, you need to understand how the molecule actually travels in our body. What is the route of administration? Are we going to take this molecule orally, or are we going to inhale it through the lungs? And then in number four, we need to understand the molecular mechanism of how this molecule interacts with the cannabinoid receptor. And this is based on the concept of a key lock, where THC, the molecule, is the key, and the cannabinoid receptor is the lock. And as you enter the key into the lock, you can unlock something and change the activity of a neuron or a cell, which is in number five. One of the important concept that I'd like to emphasize is the therapeutic index, which is the dose that you need to provide to, for example, the patient to have a therapeutic effect. I will reduce these seizures. And then there's a toxicity effect. If I increase the dose, now I will start getting some toxicity. The big advantage of cannabinoids is they have a very broad therapeutic index. And that's really good in our favor if we want to go all the way into human clinical trials. So what I thought I'd do is in this one slide, kind of give you a brief update of the most recent exciting discoveries that have been done in basic research on cannabinoid research. In A is the pharmacokinetic profile. So now we're starting to better understand how this molecule travels into our body, either through those vape pens that have been recently developed or through these oral devices. One thing that is arising in the industry and is being sold are, for example, the dabbing systems, which actually provide very high concentration of compound and very rapid onset. So if you take the curve that shows a very up and down, that's when you bring it to the lungs. The dabbing will have an even sharper and higher level, and that is concerned for toxicity. The other curve that is more round-shaped is the oral delivery, and that is actually something to think about in therapeutics, is that probably having very low doses for very long time could be the therapeutic approach. So oral delivery is a really interesting route of administration. In B is that we now have an atomic understanding of the cannabinoid receptors. So we are in prime position to start addressing how we can optimize these molecules and actually have better molecules. The cannabinoid receptors, which are the lock, are expressed throughout the body. They have very high expression for cannabinoid CB1 receptors in the brain, but these receptors are also expressed in the periphery and by many different types of cell types. And that gives us an understanding of the diverse medical properties that these molecules can have. They're anti-inflammatory because the cannabinoid receptors are expressed by immune cells. We understand also indeed the cellular response to cannabinoids in very detail. This is an example of a single neuron in one area of the brain, the hippocampus, and we have a very good understanding of how cannabinoids can change the activity of those cells. And then we also we're starting to understand the neuronal pathways that are involved in the brain that are regulated by cannabinoids, as well as immune cells. So I think the field is doing quite a bit of progress and has a lot of work to be done. In E is again the therapeutic index, but represented slightly differently. On the y-axis, the vertical is the therapeutic index, and you see that THC actually has a pretty low therapeutic index early in age. It's only as we go out of childhood and adolescence and in adulthood that the therapeutic index is much wider. CBD seems to have a better therapeutic index to start with. Okay, our body actually produces molecules that can act on these cannabinoid receptors, and those are the endogenous cannabinoid molecules, and they regulate similar functions that have been regulated by the plant-derived. So we're going to try to foster that. Okay, so in the big picture, we already talked quite a bit of the potential harm, and I think the importance to emphasize here is that the harm is age-dependent. I think it's very important that we study the potential toxicity of cannabinoids during pregnancy, but also in our young adult population, because these molecules are involved, we know that they are involved in the development of the brain, and therefore flooding the brain of young age individuals full of THC is very likely to actually impair brain development. There's also several very exciting harm reduction aspects to cannabinoids. We'll be talking a lot about the opioids and how we can actually probably reduce the potential of an opioid epidemics. And that's because they act in a very similar way. They can be painkillers, and yet they can act in a very different way than opioids. And then the other point is with the epilepsy. So this is the part that I'm going to be quickly focusing on. So this is a major health disease. I'm particularly sensitive to diseases that affect the younger populations, and the standard care that is for these patients is really dismal. This is an interesting story. I say this is usually science in reverse, where the initial evidence in the 70s and in the 2000s that cannabinoids can reduce seizures in preclinical mouse models were already published. So we've known for a while that this molecule can have anti-epileptic properties. But then eventually it's really the patients and the parents that were able to move this to the forefront of our understanding. There were a couple of clinical reports that showed the efficacy in humans. But truly, Charlotte from Charlotte's Web Figi, you have a picture of her. She is the example of a patient who was undergoing more than 100 seizures per week, and then eventually got complete relief to 1 to 2 seizures per week by using cannabidiol. And then when we needed to provide cannabidiol to this patient continuously, it became a much bigger legal problem. Today, we're starting to get some clinical trial evidence that cannabidiol can actually have some effects, and we're very excited about the potential first FDA approval of cannabidiol for these patients. So what we've done here at the University of Washington is try to study this. This is the study in reverse. We have already evidence that it works in the human patients. Let's see if it works in our mouse models of epilepsy. And for example, here in collaboration with the lab of Bill Catterall in pharmacology, we have these mouse models that mimic the Dravet syndrome, which is one of those very devastating type of seizures. And they undergo seizures. And then in B, you can see that if you provide them with cannabidiol, the seizure duration actually reduces. So it works also in our little mice. So this is true. And we can actually monitor it. And these mice actually die because of those seizures, and we can actually save a big portion of these mice by treating them with cannabidiol. This is exciting because now we actually have the preclinical tools where we can optimize. I am not sure that cannabidiol is the absolute best molecule to stop these seizures. And because now we have the preclinical tools, we can try to optimize this and make a really, truly transformative medicine. Another thing that we do, particularly in my lab, is to study the role of the endogenous cannabinoids. If cannabidiol or THC has some anti-seizure properties, maybe by enhancing our own production of endogenous cannabinoids, we can produce the same medical benefit. So we're targeting the endogenous system. So here's some examples. For example, the mouse models that undergo seizures in B. And in C is an inhibitor of one of those enzymes of these endogenous cannabinoids. And if you inhibit this enzyme, you'll increase the tone and maybe produce some anti-seizure properties. And we did the experiments and it works. So this is, again, a very exciting new therapeutic approach where we might be able to control seizures by targeting our own endogenous cannabinoid signaling system. And in just to conclude, so over the years at the University of Washington, I've been probably one of the first one who I've been doing cannabinoid research for 25 years. I've had a Schedule I license for about 20 years. And so I've been always following this field very closely. And when the legalization happened several years ago, we started thinking about how the University of Washington can actually mobilize and try to help with the process. So what we did is we started looking at all the different schools that are interested in cannabis-based research. And ADAI obviously is a leader and has been at the forefront at the beginning, but the School of Medicine, the School of Law, School of Environment, all these different schools were actually spinning their wheels independently. And what we decided to do is to organize all this brain power into a center for cannabis research. So we've been working on this for about for several years now, and this year I think we've done quite a bit of good progress. We've starting to identify all the different laboratories and research team at the University of Washington that are interested in cannabis research. We have a list of over 100 people that are really interested. We're reaching out to WSU to create this bridge between those two universities so that we can exchange our ideas. There's very different areas of expertise that we can synergize. So we're really excited about this work around cannabis and bringing these groups together. And I'm looking forward to your very hard questions when we're on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stella. I wasn't sure what to expect when we were talking about the very small molecules on this, but it's fascinating. I will next hear from Dr. Michael Moran, whose talk is about assessment of the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids for pain. Dr. Morgan is a professor of psychology at the Washington State University, Vancouver campus. His research is focused on opioid mechanisms for the treatment of pain, the impact of chronic pain on the magnitude and duration of spontaneous opioid withdrawal, and the interaction between mu, opioid, and CBI cannabinoid receptors in the para-aqueductal gray. Excuse me, again, more on Dr. Morgan's career is on the Symposium folder insert. Welcome, Dr. Moran. Dr. Morgan.
Okay, as you can see, I'm going to talk about cannabinoids and pain, but before I get into the cannabinoids, I first want to say that in terms of pain treatment, opioids are the most effective treatment for pain. The problem with opioids is that they have lots of problems, and so their side effects, tolerance, and dependence. And this is the place where cannabinoids can help out. And a graduate student, A.D. Wilson, she got me engaged in this research when she was working in my lab. And this is a study that we did where we were looking at the effects of repeated administration of THC. And so we gave rats THC twice a day for 2 days. And then a day later, we gave them morphine. And so the morphine dose response curve is right here. That's the control group. When you give the rats THC on those 2 days before, the dose response curve shifts to the left. That means that at any given dose, morphine's working better than it was here. So the THC, just by pre-treating the animal, was enhancing the analgesic effect of morphine 24 hours later. So there's a lot of potential if this translates to human in terms of lowering opioid doses. The problem with this study is that it was funded by the stimulus package in 2009. And the reason I say that was a problem is because Tom Coburn put that on his list of 100 most wasteful stimulus-funded projects. And so the media descended on this, on me, and then there was a bill introduced in Congress by Darrell Issa, trying to withdraw funding from my grant specifically. He subsequently withdrew that. When Dino Rossi was running for governor, he put out a thing not only criticizing me and my research, but WSU as a whole, as if we were giving THC or marijuana to students. In addition to wasting a month of my life dealing with this stuff, it also just shook me because as a scientist, I was under the assumption that we did research and then we presented the research to policymakers and then they would use that to make decisions. Where in this case, everyone had prejudged the study beforehand and was critical of it without even willing to look at the research. So, in particular, the cost of pain is extremely high. So the amount that they had invested in the study, which was only $100,000 over 2 years, potentially could have been quite useful. There's lots of suffering, and there's lots of costs associated with the pain problem. Likewise, there's lots of problems and costs associated with using opioids to treat pain. This is not a new problem, as shown by the fact that Elvis Presley died of an opioid overdose in the 70s, but it's become much greater. This is just showing the last 20 years. This is from the Centers for Disease Control, and you can see how many overdose deaths there are. 60,000 a year in 2016. So we have a huge problem, and this is the place where cannabinoids may be useful in terms of reducing this number. So I did a literature search and came up with the survey data for cannabinoid use. So these are just surveys being done where you're asking people why they're using, and it doesn't matter if it's a recreational or a medical marijuana use population, or if it's in Germany or in the United States. The data are consistent. People use marijuana for pain problems. Those are the ones listed in red that have pain-related issues there. The one on the end here, it was Carrie Cutler's data that she'd presented earlier today. The title of the slide says suggest, and the reason it says suggest is because survey data is anecdotal. This person thinks it helped them. This person, has various reasons why they might think it helps them. There's a placebo effect. Who knows? So what you really want to do are randomized controlled trials. And the way a randomized controlled trial works is I would take this whole population of people here. Half of you I would give marijuana to. The other half would get something that smells like marijuana but has no marijuana in it. And then I would look at your pain problems later. And then I would know how much that marijuana is actually helping people. When you do these studies, the data for neuropathic pain are the best data out there in terms of pain problems. But even with neuropathic pain, the effects are relatively small. So I highlighted in red here that in this Abrams study, 52% of the people who were in the marijuana group got an improvement in their pain. 24% got an improvement just from taking the placebo. So there is an analgesic effect, but it's not a big effect. And in fact, in this study at the bottom using multiple sclerosis patients, the placebo group actually had greater pain reduction than the marijuana group. Okay? So the effects look small. But if you compare that with the animal literature is consistent. That, and I just did a sampling here of studies. I could have picked a lot more, but they go back to the 70s. And every one of them shows that cannabinoids are blocking pain. Keep in mind here that these doses are relatively high, because I'm going to come back to that point. And the other thing that you'll see with these studies is that there's lots of side effects. Most of these studies didn't look at it. This study by Stevie Britch, who's sitting in the third row, she did look at side effects. And so that's an issue, too, that I'm going to come back to. When you get into hindpaw inflammation, so more of a chronic type of pain, then the doses go down a little bit. But it works in pretty much all animal studies. The problem is how much are these sedative and immobility effects confounding the data. And these are just fake data. That's very popular these days. And the way most rats are tested is you put them on a hot plate or some other test that gives them a pain stimulus, and then the animal moves away. And a normal animal will, lick its foot in 10 seconds when it's standing on a hot plate. If you give it morphine, it'll stand on that plate as long as you want. You don't leave it on there forever, but that's the good analgesic effect. The confound is that if I anesthetize the animal with pentobarbital, that does have a huge sedative effect, the animal also stays on that plate for 50 seconds. Or if I take a dead rat and put it on that plate, it'll stay there. And no one no physician would recommend death as a treatment for pain, okay? So there's the confound. So in terms of research goals, on the clinical side, we need more randomized controlled studies, and we need them for other pain conditions than neuropathic pain. On the animal side, the research needs to be more clinically relevant. And so, in humans, you're measuring pain using a visual analog scale, just rating your pain on a 1 to 10 scale. You can't do that with rats. They don't talk. We test rats on a hot plate test, but no physician would test a human that way, okay? It doesn't make sense. So the question is where is the overlap between the animal research and the human research? And one of the solutions to this problem that we've focused on is activity. So if you have back pain, one of the things you'll do is you won't go and exercise that day. In fact, if the back pain is bad enough, you won't even go to work. And so with rats, we can do the same kind of thing. We put a running wheel in their cage. The rats will run. And if you introduce a pain problem, it should reduce that running. So you'll notice these data here are very similar to what you would see with a human, in that the rats are active 12 hours a day, and in the other 12 hours, they're relatively quiet. Same thing as you. The big difference is the rats are active at night. When you're asleep, they're in your kitchen, and when you're awake, they're asleep. Okay? Just share the same space at different times. The other thing the women in this audience will notice is that the women work a lot harder than the men. Okay? So now, when you look at these are the data I presented before. Now I have new fake data. And in this case, I introduce a pain problem. It reduces the wheel running. If I give a pain treatment like morphine, then it recovers them. So we're looking at recovery of function. But if I anesthetize the animal and make it sedated, it doesn't run. I put a dead rat in a cage, it doesn't run either. Okay? So this test is useful both because it's more clinically relevant and because I can actually look at the effect of a drug at the same time I'm looking at the side effects of that drug. So here's some data with migraine. This is a model of migraine in a rat. And what you do is you inject this chemical, AITC, onto the dura mater, the covering of the brain. So it's underneath the skull. And what it does is it activates these fibers down there, and it causes a depression in wheel running. So this is baseline levels at 100%. It causes a drop in wheel running that lasts about 3 hours. That looks a lot like a migraine. Now, I'm not saying this is a migraine. I'm saying it's migraine-like pain. Okay? But then on this side, all these animals got the AITC, the migraine-like pain, and then they got different doses of THC. One thing you'll notice right off the bat is that the doses we're using here are 1/10 of what I was reporting before. Okay? The 0.1 dose doesn't do anything. They still have the same migraine. But you get to 0.32, and it actually causes recovery of function. You go to a higher dose of THC, 1 milligram per kilogram, and they're back down here. That does not mean that the 1 milligram has lost its analgesic effect. It is still analgesic, but the side effects start coming in and start pushing it down. So the therapeutic window for THC is narrow. That's what we're talking about. Any pain medication that you're going to use has to be used repeatedly. And so that's what these studies do. On the left side here, we have morphine data. Morphine does work to treat migraine, and that's what you see here. Morphine only lasts about 90 minutes, so you get a blip there at that time point, but then it drops off. If you give morphine repeatedly, animals become tolerant very quickly, and then you get no effect of morphine down here. But that's in contrast to the THC data. These animals got THC once, the same data I showed you before, 0.32 blocks the migraine. These animals got THC twice a day for 2 days, and it still works. So there was no tolerance in this case. Animals do become tolerant to THC, but in those other studies, they typically use a larger dose for a longer period of time. At the doses that we're using and the time frame that we're using, we're not seeing any tolerance to THC. In this study, one of the big issues with migraine in particular is that the more you use a treatment to reduce the migraine, the more you set yourself up for chronic migraine. That's medication overuse headaches. You get more migraines and they're worse. And so these animals were treated twice a day for 2 days with morphine or with THC or with just a control substance. And when you do that with morphine, what happens is this 3-hour migraine that we had before now lasts 4 hours. It enhances it. With THC, we don't get that effect. It's the same 3-hour migraine. No one's getting drug on this day. It's just a pre-treatment before. Okay? So THC looks promising in this light. I came into this talking about clinically relevant animal research and our approach using the running wheel as a way to make it clinically relevant. But I did want to mention some of my colleagues at WSU who are doing other things that are clinically relevant, like looking at females. Most of the research in pain research is on males. Rebecca Kraft does work in females. Carrie Cutler mentioned earlier her husband. I admit he's cute. But he's looking at vapor chambers so that animals can inhale the drug. So that's also a clinically relevant approach. Neither of them could be here, and that's why you got me. Why this matters. In terms of cannabinoids and opioids, I say again, opioids are a better pain treatment. They're more effective. But all of these problems are things that cannabinoids do not have. You don't have 60,000 people dying of cannabinoid overdoses. In fact, you don't have any. And so that's the trade-off really in this issue. In terms of moving forward, more research is always good. There are a lot of chemicals, as we just heard, and so which are the best for treating pain, which doses are the best. There are lots of different pain conditions. My guess is that cannabinoids work well for some and not so well for others. The age thing, I think, is huge. There's different effects when you're an adolescent, when you're an adult, and when you're a senior. And then some barriers to research. The research funding, and I know when people put that up there, what they're really saying is I need more research funding, and I do. So that's an issue. But the Schedule I classification, just to make this a little bit more real, anyone who has a Schedule I license to use marijuana gets inspected by the DEA every other year. So my visit was last week. So since I'm down in Vancouver, Washington, I had two DEA agents drive 3 hours to Vancouver. They spent 2 hours in my lab going through all of my documents, photocopied everything. Then they drove 3 hours back, and then they spent the second day writing up a report on this. The amount of marijuana that I have in my lab is less than 50 milligrams. That's less than a single joint. They spent over 8 hours dealing with this, and yet we have 60,000 people dying of an opioid overdose. They're wasting your tax money, they're wasting my time, and I just, it's a real problem. Okay, so.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. I really related to your remarks. My mother, who died 4 years ago, was really addicted to opioids, OxyContin and then fentanyl patches. And we didn't recognize it, and she just kept getting prescribed more and more, and we were finally able to wean her off. It took a long time. But she would never consider even looking into using medical marijuana because of the stigma. That was it. Okay, we will now hear from our last speaker, Dr. Michelle Bedard-Gilligan, who brings us her expertise on PTSD and cannabis. Her presentation is titled Towards a Better Understanding of Cannabis and PTSD Recovery, Exploring Outcomes and Possible Mechanisms. Dr. Bedard-Gilligan is an assistant professor in the University of Washington School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She is also a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Washington. Her federally funded research predominantly focuses on recovery processes following trauma exposure, with specific emphases on the co-occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol, and cannabis use. You can read more about her fascinating work in the folder insert. Welcome, Dr. Bedard-Gilligan.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you. I want to thank all the organizers for inviting me to speak today, and I want to thank all of you for coming back after lunch and being here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we know about cannabis as a potential treatment for PTSD following trauma exposure. And trauma exposure is a relatively common occurrence. The majority of Americans will experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Examples of traumatic stressors include things such as sexual assault, physical assault, motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, etc. And trauma exposure can have pretty devastating consequences, including resulting in mental health conditions, substance abuse problems, and increased risk for suicide or suicidal behavior. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one disorder that can follow trauma exposure, so can develop following trauma exposure. And PTSD, as it's termed, is considered etiologically linked to the traumatic event. So it's considered caused directly by the traumatic experience itself. And it's characterized by symptoms such as re-experiencing, which includes things like intrusive memories and nightmares, pervasive and persistent avoidance of trauma-related stimuli or things that remind you of the trauma, and increased hypervigilance or arousal. So this is things like increased startle response, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, etc. And as I mentioned, PTSD does develop following trauma exposure, but it's also important to remember that it doesn't always develop following trauma exposure. And so the reality is that the majority of people actually recover following trauma exposure naturally. So what I'm showing here on this graph is victims of rape. So this is what victims of rape will report following the experience of rape. And you can see that immediately following rape, which is considered a particularly severe form of trauma exposure, almost all victims will report symptoms of PTSD. But over time, that number declines. And by the end of 3 months, only about 50% of rape victims are still reporting symptoms of PTSD. And this is without any intervention. So we really think of PTSD as a failure to recover. So whereas other individuals recover naturally, people who develop PTSD don't. Something gets in the way of their natural recovery. And a failure in what we call fear extinction is one proposed mechanism for what causes the persistence of PTSD symptoms in some individuals. And to talk about fear extinction, it actually helps to take a step back and first talk about fear conditioning, which is the process by which individuals can learn to be kind of pathologically afraid following things like trauma exposure. And the basic principles of fear conditioning are that people learn to be afraid because a neutral or an ambiguous stimulus gets paired with something really aversive, and that results in a kind of generalized fear reaction. So the best way to explain it is to take an example. So we might have something like a dog, which to most of us is neutral or ambiguous. It doesn't carry a lot of meaning necessarily, but if that dog gets paired with something universally aversive, which we might call an unconditioned stimulus, like a really severe bite, what that will happen is that in that moment, it will lead to an unconditioned reaction of fear. The response of fear, because a bite is fairly distressing. But what can happen following an experience like that is that the dog can become a conditioned stimulus. So what happens is that because of that powerful learning experience, the dog itself now evokes the reaction of fear. And so the dog, even in the absence of a bite, will now make the person feel afraid. And this is the process of fear conditioning, how we think people learn to be afraid of things. And fear extinction is the process by which people can learn to inhibit those conditioned responses. So the way people can learn to no longer feel afraid in response to just the previously neutral stimulus. So how we bring about fear extinction is we will take the conditioned stimulus, so what used to be neutral but is now conditioned, and we will present it repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus. So in this case, the dog without the bite. So we'll get lots of friendly dogs, hopefully, and we'll have the individual interact, right? And in the absence of a bite, over time, the individual's fear response will start to be inhibited. So they'll stop displaying that pathological fear response to just the presence of a dog. And PTSD is extremely similar. So it's the same process. So for individuals who experience traumatic events, they are extremely powerful unconditioned stimuli. A traumatic event is an extremely powerful learning experience. And so for fear conditioning, what we think happens is that individuals will pair the neutral and ambiguous stimuli that were going on at the time of the event, and they'll start to experience fear in response to those reminders. So here we have an example of let's say a woman who was raped in her home. So her home is a neutral stimuli. She's raped in it. She experiences fear during the event, a completely unconditioned response. But following that rape, her home becomes a conditioned stimuli. And now all of a sudden, she's afraid to be home alone. Even when nothing bad is happening, she's afraid. And for individuals with PTSD, this conditioned learning is pervasive. So they'll start to learn these associations for a variety of stimuli that were present at the time of the traumatic event. And how we enhance recovery is through what we call fear extinction, what I talked about earlier with the dog, same process. So we take the conditioned stimuli, the house, we have the individual spend time there in the absence of danger, and over time, the fear response will start to diminish just in the home, right? And fear extinction is actually directly clinically relevant in the field of PTSD. It translates directly on to many of our most effective interventions. And the reality is we do have a lot of interventions that are really helpful for PTSD. So medications have pretty moderate effect sizes, I would say, response rates of about 50%, whereas our psychotherapies have pretty large effect sizes. So anything over 1 is considered an extremely large effect size for therapy. And you can see we have a number of therapy options that are showing very strong effects. Including these 3 that I'm going to highlight, which are all variants of exposure therapy, which is directly based on extinction learning principles. So it's a direct translation of that in terms of how we provide clinical care. The problem is that not all of our patients respond. So we still have a significant minority of patients who will not respond to any of the treatments we have for PTSD. And we also have a sizable number of patients who don't want to do them. So they're just not good options for them for whatever reason. And so we're constantly looking for new approaches to help trauma survivors kind of go on that recovery process. And cannabis is consistently floated as one of those. And cannabis use has been increasing substantially in the last several decades, as we've seen in previous talks. And individuals with PTSD are particularly likely to report cannabis use. So they're more likely than individuals without PTSD to report regular cannabis use. In addition, in states that have legalized medical marijuana or medical cannabis, PTSD is one of the #1 reasons that gets cited for why people are seeking it out. And why do patients with PTSD use cannabis? The most common motivations that we hear are things that we, again, heard earlier this morning, that it helps with their symptoms, but it helps them feel less anxious, it helps them tolerate distress, it might help them sleep better. That's consistently the main motivators that we hear reported. And there is good speculation that targeting the endocannabinoid system that Neffy just talked about, the system that's in our brain, could actually be a promising treatment for decreasing PTSD symptoms. And this is based on our understanding of the role of cannabinoid receptors in how they process things like fear and stress and reward in the brain. And fear, stress, and reward are all things that are kind of pinpointed in the diagnosis of PTSD. There are deficits in those areas for individuals with PTSD. And so it's thought that things like exogenous cannabinoids like THC and CBD might be a really good pathway to treating PTSD, to being able to correct some of these deficits. And when we think about the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis for PTSD, we can think about it, or the 2 that I'm going to talk about, are as an extinction enhancer. So coming back to these extinction learning principles and the effects that cannabis might have on learning not to be afraid. And we can think of it as a way to manage the emotional symptoms. So really leveraging the anxiolytic effects that we know are in cannabis. So if we talk about the first one, how do cannabis and extinction learning maybe interact? I'm going to start by talking about a little bit of animal data. So we have a fairly robust literature in rats that CB agonists can facilitate the extinction of fear. So what I'm presenting here is some data that shows that if we bring rats into a lab and we condition them to be afraid, so we take a neutral stimulus and we pair it with something like a shock, and we teach them to be afraid of that neutral stimulus, and then we teach them to be unafraid by doing extinction learning. If you give them a CB agonist, which is represented here with the AM404 bar and line, they will learn to be afraid more quickly than rats, I work mostly with people, than rats who are given a vehicle that does not contain the agonist. So it looks like if we administer agonists to rats, we can actually facilitate fear extinction. There's a couple caveats, which is that we've also seen chronic higher doses may impair extinction. So again, several people were talking about this earlier, about use patterns and dose being really important. And in animals, it does look like that holds up here as well, that there's a sweet spot for amount, and then if you go over that, we actually see the opposite. Instead of a facilitation effect, we see impairment in extinction learning. In humans, we have less research, but we're starting to accumulate some on how cannabinoids might affect extinction learning in people. This is some data by Christine Rabenak, who's in Michigan at Wayne State University, and she showed that if you administer THC, again, you bring people in a lab, you do a fear conditioning task and then a fear extinction task. If you give them THC, we can facilitate fear extinction. So you can see the green bar is the placebo and the red bar is the THC. And individuals who are given the THC are showing less of a skin conductance response. That's a sweat response on the palm, which is considered a marker of fear. And they're showing less of that response during extinction learning if you've been given THC. Again, there's a couple caveats to these findings, though. So facilitation looks like it could be limited to acute effects. So additional studies that have looked at longer-term follow-up show that placebo and THC groups start to look the same after more time passes. So it may not be something that lasts. We also see that a very recent study did not show it in chronic cannabis users. So individuals who are using cannabis chronically did not experience the same facilitation of extinction as individuals who were not. The other caveat is all these studies have been done in healthy volunteers. So we have yet to know how this might function in individuals with PTSD. In terms of the second proposal, so what about the anxiolytic effects of cannabis and symptom management? We have 2 small trials so far, so nothing that looks like the big RCT that we need, but we do have 2 small open trials that have looked at cannabis as a treatment for PTSD. In the first, oral THC was administered twice a day for 3 weeks to 10 patients who had PTSD. And when they looked pre-post, they saw that the individuals were lower in arousal symptoms, so there was a significant decrease in arousal symptoms from pre to post treatment, but there was no significant change in intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, or PTSD severity. So while there was an effect on decreasing symptoms, it was limited, and it wasn't kind of wide-ranging. A second study looked at a CB agonist for individuals who were experiencing treatment-resistant nightmares. So they had tried a number of things for PTSD-related nightmares, and they were still experiencing highly intense and frequent nightmares. And they were given the CB agonist for anywhere from 4 to 12 months, based on their physician judgment and some variety of other factors. And what we saw at post-treatment was that almost 60% of individuals given the agonist had a complete cessation of nightmares. And on just under 13% had a significant reduction in nightmares. So pretty good responses. The caveat, once again, is that less than 1% of patients sustained those improvements when the agonist was discontinued. So it worked as long as it was on board, but as soon as they stopped taking it, the nightmares returned. This really suggests this Band-Aid idea that somebody mentioned earlier, where it's masking the symptom, it's treating the symptom effectively, which may be enough, or may not be enough, right? We haven't really tied it all together. So we just started looking at our data where we're looking at how cannabis might impact PTSD treatment outcome if individuals are getting an extinction-based treatment. So one of those exposure treatments that I talked about earlier. And so we looked in our clinical trial data at individuals who were using cannabis versus not using cannabis and receiving exposure therapy. And what we saw was that individuals who were using cannabis were actually much more likely to drop out of treatment. So about twice as likely. And they also had more PTSD symptoms 6-month follow-up than individuals not using cannabis. Note that they got better. So the orange line is the individuals who were using cannabis, and they got significantly better from pre to post treatment, as did the patients not using cannabis, but they didn't get quite as much better. And so there's not a contraindication for doing extinction-based treatments when cannabis is on board, but there it doesn't support the facilitation effects. So what do we take for all this? So PTSD is an approved condition for medical cannabis. And by putting it on that list, we are implying that it is an efficacious approach. And the reality is we don't necessarily have the data to back that up. The data that we have is pretty limited and also somewhat inconsistent. We also have to remember the theories of why cannabis might help with PTSD. And extinction learning has been robustly shown to be related to both natural and therapeutic recovery following trauma exposure, but it's contingent on approach. So the only way we do extinction learning and extinguish fear responses is by approaching the thing we're afraid of. And this might be really inconsistent with how many people use cannabis, because we know there's amotivational effects. And so really we need to be able to test that. In addition, it looks like the anxiolytic effects are temporary. And so we know that there's biphasic effects associated with heavy and chronic cannabis use, and that, using the cannabis for anxiolytic properties is something that we have to keep doing. And so that comes with things like risk of dependence or risk of kind of chronic consequences of using cannabis frequently. So moving forward, to me, one of the most promising areas of research is really to understand how cannabis can be coupled with behavior changes to really enhance recovery following trauma. We need a better understanding of mechanisms of change, and we need to be able to better understand the discrepancies we're seeing in animal models and human data. And the reality is there's a lot of real-world variability in how humans behave compared to animals in a lab. And so we really need to better understand how cannabis is interacting with behavior in recovery. And we're doing a study right now that's starting to try and answer these questions. So we have a small RCT that's looking at a very brief exposure treatment. So it's based on extinction learning principles. And we're taking individuals who are naturalistically using cannabis or not using cannabis. We're measuring extinction learning deficits. We're measuring THC levels. We're measuring CBD levels at each session. And we're trying to look at how cannabis might affect outcome. So how it might affect trauma recovery. And I think it's these kinds of studies that are needed if we're going to better understand for whom and under what circumstances cannabis might promote recovery following trauma. So finally, the music is playing if we were at the Oscars, which we're clearly not, but if we were. I want to thank my collaborators, including all my colleagues at the University of Washington Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress, where this work is being done, as well as my colleagues in psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and our funding agency, NIDA. And then finally, I just wanted to put up a slide with our contact information in case anyone is interested in learning more about our study or about the work we're doing. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bedard Gilligan. And I would like to say, if you don't know, having PTSD be incorporated into our state statute as an allowable medical condition was very tough. There was a huge amount of resistance. It had to be tried for several years, and we finally got that included. We're now going to go on to our discussion phase of this program for this panel. And we have only about 15 minutes, so I'd like our three panelists to come and sit at the table. And I'm going to ask some questions, and we'll have to get very concise responses because of the shortness of time. I don't know if the panelists heard me say that. Panelists? We only have 15 minutes, so we're going to have to ask you to keep your answers very concise, okay? A couple of minutes each, and then we'll see if we can have more time to ask any more questions. Our first question is for Dr. Stella, and I would like to say we have more questions than we can get to, so I'm trying to pick out some good ones. They're all good, but Dr. Stella, we'd like to hear a little bit more about the difference in efficacy between 100% CBD and a ratio of CBD to THC and its use for seizure relief.
Oh,
Thank you.
That's a good question. So one needs to think about how both THC and CBD work at the basic level, at the molecular level. And they act on two very different systems. Even though they're both cannabinoid compounds, they are two different keys that act on two very different types of locks. So I think, so that's the first thing, is that they have different mechanism of action, THC and CBD. The second thing is that there's a very wide diversity in the types of seizures that patients can get. And therefore, the field is thinking that there might be some ratios of THC, CBD that might be more beneficial for one type of seizure versus another one. So I don't have the exact ratio that is needed, but I think what the field is doing is try to understand these different ratios and try to optimize them for each type of seizures.
Thank you, and very concise.
Nice.
Great
Yeah.
work.
I listen to directions.
You may get another question. Okay. Dr. Morgan, what is the consensus on the direct interactions between the opioid and cannabinoid receptors? Is this one way in which cannabinoids enhance the effects of opioids, or what?
Yeah, so in terms of the data on opioids and cannabinoids, you can give them together and you get synergistic effects. You can do it the way I talked about it, where you give them on different days and you get enhanced effects. In terms of mechanism, when you look down at the cell level, both cannabinoids and opioids inhibit GABAergic neurons, which are inhibiting other neurons, and so they're both kind of acting on the same mechanism. When you label for cannabinoid receptors, they're all over the place. I mean, in the brain. So the opioid receptors are a lot more discrete in that regard. But in terms of what's going on inside the cell and how they're interacting, I don't think that's known.
Okay.
Concise.
Yes, you're all excellent. We may have to get some more questions up here. Dr. Bedard Gilligan, in PTSD studies, was there a control for subjects managing withdrawal symptoms?
Is this on? Okay, that's a really great question, and not that I know of. So these were really small open trials that didn't include a lot of controls at all. And so, no, as far as I know, there was not.
Okay, thank you. Dr.
It was really concise.
Okay, you really were. Dr. Stella, and this one is more open-ended, so we'll see the challenge you have in keeping this one concise, but it's an important one. Can you say anything more about the cancer results? And does cannabis inhibit growth rates directly or boost immune response or use some other mechanism?
Okay. Again, a really good series of questions. So the ability of cannabinoids to kill cancer cells has actually was discovered in the 70s when NIH was testing all these different plant-derived molecules to see if they were able to reduce cancer growth. So in the 70s, there was initial papers showing that cannabinoids can inhibit cancer cell proliferation, for example, for lung cancers. And then in 2000, this research was revived by a laboratory in Spain that showed that cannabinoids are really good at killing brain tumors, the GBM, the really nasty tumors. And that was actually the paper that stimulated my lab to start studying this mechanism of action. And the first thing that we realized is that the ability of cannabinoids to kill cancer cells does not involve the same molecular mechanism that we're familiar with. We're familiar with two main types of receptors, the CB1 receptors and the CB2 receptors. And the ability of those cannabinoid compounds to kill the cancer cells did not make sense with the pharmacology of how they act on the CB1 and CB2 receptor. And truly, as a scientist, that was what piqued my attention, was that, oh, there might be a novel mechanism of action. So we've been studying this mechanism of action for about 15 years now, and we have a better understanding of how it works, and it does inhibit cancer cell proliferation. And what we've discovered in the last 4 or 5 years is we're starting to understand what are the type of cancer cells that are particularly sensitive to the cannabinoids. Because cancer is such a wide diversity in types and subtypes that we are now pinpointing the actual subtypes that are particularly sensitive. So for example, GBM is one, but we also discovered that some really nasty melanoma cancers can be killed by cannabinoids, and some also really nasty colorectal cancer cells. The advantage that we've always been fostering in optimizing those molecules as anti-cancer drugs is we're trying to keep the therapeutic index very large, because we know how devastating side effects are associated with chemotherapeutics. So providing anti-cancer that has a good safety profile would already be a good advantage. The other thing is that these molecules are really good in going into the brain, and we're keeping that ability so that now we can actually target also brain metastases. So I think it's a very exciting area of research. It's still in the early days, but if we're able to push that forward, I think we'll have a completely new type of anti-cancer drugs.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Morgan, does THC increase top-down suppression of afferent pain of afferent pain signals, reduce the strength of bottom-up pain signals, both, neither, what?
Okay, so what she's getting at is, when you feel pain, it comes in from your skin, goes up your spinal cord, and you can block that in the spinal cord. So if you had an epidural with an opiate during childbirth, it would just block that message from reaching the up. But you also have systems in your brain, the periaqueductal gray and other regions, that can be activated, and they turn those things off naturally too. So it can go in either direction. The stuff that we've studied in my lab is that descending modulatory system. So blocking, activating the periaqueductal gray, you can inject drugs, cannabinoids in there, and you get analgesic effects. Once again, the analgesic effects of cannabinoids, whether it's injected into the PAG or systemically, is mild compared to the effects you get with an opiate, but you do get them in both cases.
Okay, Dr. Bedard Gilligan. When a patient goes off an antipsychotic medication and becomes psychotic, is that considered the medicine itself failing? It seems that this is the standard with marijuana and PTSD.
If I think it's the medicine failing, as much as some medicines work to suppress symptoms and some medicines work to actually change what's causing the symptoms. And in the case of PTSD, it seems from the very limited data that we have that cannabis might be, when administered just on its own without behavior changes accompanying it, that it might be suppressing the symptoms, which is one way to go and one way to treat PTSD. The problem I see with that is that we have a number of treatments that can actually change what's underlying the symptoms. So our psychotherapy rates, for example, we have 70% response rates, and we do not see remission of symptoms, or return of symptoms after therapy has ended. People get better and they stay better. And so we're treating the underlying cause. And if we can do that, then why would we use something that's just suppressing the symptoms? And this is where I think if we couple it with behavior change, it could get some more people to respond. So we might be able to enhance that 70% response rate. But if we can do better than just masking the symptoms, then we should, is my opinion. And it seems for PTSD that we can.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Stella, what are you finding on treating gloma with pain? Is that the right word? Glioma. With pain, with cannabis.
The results that I'm sorry.
What are you finding on treating glioma with cannabis?
Okay, so the question is by which mechanism is the cannabinoids affecting the tumor? It's actually quite fascinating in terms of basic science how it works. A lot of the chemotherapeutics that are prescribed to patients are drugs that are able to reduce the proliferation of the cancer, and therefore you can stop the cancer growth. What we've discovered is that these cannabinoids are able to trigger a mechanism which is called apoptosis, which is a suicide mechanism that is present in cells. And therefore, not only we're able to reduce the progression of the cancer cells, but actually kill the cancer cells and remove the tumor mass. There was another question that was raised before. Does it have an effect on the immune system? And especially in these times where immunotherapy is becoming so prevalent to start treating cancer patients, one of the things that we want to make sure is that our compound will actually not inhibit the immune system, because the immune system is supposed to help us take care of the cancer cells. So we're trying to optimize our cannabinoid compounds in that direction also, so that it actually helps the immune system, boosts further the immune system to take care of the cancer.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Morgan, I love this question. What is the impact of being stoned on self-report of pain?
I have no personal experience with that.
Of course not.
Yeah, I was going to say for both reasons, the pain problem and being stoned. Yeah, so I think that gets at the heart of part of the issue that I was talking about, is that when you talk about cannabinoids, the pain inhibition piece is relatively small, but when you have people taking it for whatever reason, it might be helping someone just deal with the pain and not really suppressing the pain itself. And so I think that's the real issue. And if people are getting benefits from it, as those survey results indicate, well, does it matter so much? The thing that I'm mostly interested in is getting people to return to normal function. If someone's stoned and just sitting on their sofa, or if they have a pain problem and they're just sitting on their sofa, they're not really contributing to society, And so I would say that those are both problems, but they're different problems.
Okay, thank you. And our last question will go to Dr. Bedard Gilligan. Most of your research was referencing THC, but what about using CBD for PTSD?
Studies on it. There has been some studies done more recently with CBD and extinction learning, and it seems to have a similar effect as THC. So it does also seem to enhance extinction. I just didn't present that data up there today. And in terms of I don't think anyone's looked specifically at CBD for the management of symptoms in terms of what people might look like pre-post CBD administration or anything like that, but we need to look at it.
Okay. Well, we have other questions we're not able to get to, but we appreciate all those of you who submitted questions. Maybe you can talk with the panelists later, but let's give a big round of applause for our panelists. It was a very invigorating discussion, and really appreciate your being with us, and I certainly learned a lot. And I will now take a break and be back at 2:45 for the last panel of the day. Thank you.
All right, so it's my honor to introduce the next moderator of our panel, who's musically gifted, clearly, Dr. Kevin Haggerty. Dr. Haggerty is the director of the Social Development Research Group and a professor in the UW School of Social Work. For more than 30 years, he's focused on developing innovative ways to organize the scientific knowledge base for prevention so that parents, communities, schools can better identify, assess, and prioritize approaches that prevent substance use and delinquent behaviors. I've also learned from colleagues that he also enjoys outdoor activities, and he's recently added the title of grandfather to his list of prestigious accomplishments. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Haggerty to our final panel of the day.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'm GPA. That's what the consensus is so far, but we'll see what happens when she starts talking. You never really can tell. I wanted to just thank you so much, and to Bia, thank you for the invitation to moderate. I wanted to just start by saying a couple things. First, I was involved in the outlay of I-502 in two really important areas. One, ensuring that there was funding for the Healthy Youth Survey in Washington State. Prior to this, there was no dedicated funding for the Healthy Youth Survey, and so I-502 has actually allowed us to have some dedicated funding for the Healthy Youth Survey and for a young adult survey. And so I think that's really important. And also to really promote ensuring that there was some money to help protect those most vulnerable by providing prevention services. So now there's some, though not fully funded, dedicated money for prevention. And I just urge and hope that we can honor the voters of the state of Washington by fully funding what we voted for in I-502, both for prevention and for the research to both WSU and UW, because that was an important part of our work. And I fully believe that that will happen, so I am hopeful. The second thing I wanted to just say is it's so cool that we have our WSU colleagues here, and I've had a really amazing relationship with the folks in human development, Lori Hill and the colleagues there. We are working on a study called First Years Away from Home to help work with young people who are transferring into WSU. And so we're using a handbook approach and studying that. And it's been one of the greatest collaborations that I've had the honor to work with. And so we continue to look for opportunities to work together because it's such a valuable collaboration for both sides. So it's great to be having our WSU colleagues here. We were at WSU last week, so it's really nice to have this collaboration going on. But enough about me. What we're really here to do is really to talk about now, the substitution, combination, or both. What about these substances and how do they interact and work together? And so we're going to start by hearing from Dr. Christine Lee. And Christine, I got to go to my notes, and you can pull this out and look at more about Dr. Lee. But she's research professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at UW and associate director of the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors. And her research primarily focuses on answering questions regarding what motivates young adults to engage in high-risk behaviors, including alcohol and marijuana use, and as well as the development of efficacious prevention and intervention approaches. And she's really helped us understand how the motivations to use cannabis and the consequences of cannabis use are different than tobacco and alcohol. And so she's going to start with talking with us about simultaneous alcohol and marijuana use among young adults. So Christine?
Well, thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. This is very exciting for me to talk about this today. I'm very passionate about this topic and the research that we do, so I'm excited to share a little bit about that with you today. So as Kevin said, I'm talking about simultaneous alcohol and marijuana use among young adults today. Let's see if I can do this. So I'm just going to jump right in. In 2016, Katerina Gutmanova, myself, and other colleagues reviewed the literature on how changing marijuana policies might be affecting alcohol use. These changing policies include decriminalization, changes in medical marijuana laws, and legalization. So we reviewed the literature back then, and overwhelmingly there was two ideas that were being studied. One was that marijuana might be a substitute for alcohol, in that marijuana use might increase, but alcohol might decrease. One of the ideas behind that is that people are choosing a substance potentially choosing a substance for intoxicating effects, and that there's decision making in that, and this decision makings include costs, availability, legality, and potential harms to the individual, as well as a variety of other factors. So if all things were equal, and say if marijuana was legalized, they might choose marijuana in that acute health harms would be different, such as for alcohol overdose, that type of thing. So that's one idea. An opposite idea is that there could be complementary effects in that people are wanting to.
Need to make it closer. It's hard for.
Sorry, is this better?
Better?
Okay. Just wave your hands. And the opposite idea is complementary effects, in that both alcohol and marijuana use might increase as marijuana use goes up, in that people want these intoxicating effects, and they're going to want to chase this intoxication, and they can become increasingly more intoxicated if they used both alcohol and marijuana. So I don't know what this means about me, but this made me very excited when this was published. We were highlighted on Late Night with Seth Meyers. And, opening monologue, he says that scientists at the University of Washington are conducting a study to determine if marijuana smokers are more or less likely to drink alcohol. Here, I'll save them some time. They're less likely to do anything. I'll get back to Seth in a little while. But what are we looking at here? So I've just pulled some Healthy Youth Survey data from 2016 up at the top three lines, and the bottom comes from the National Monitoring the Future study for the college and young adult estimates. But what we see here is that nearly 2/3 of high school seniors report alcohol use in the past year, and 1/3 report using in the past month at the time of the survey. And with marijuana, 45% report lifetime use of marijuana, and 26% in the past month. You can see that the rates for college and young adults are higher. That's not surprising, particularly for lifetime use. What this doesn't tell us is, are the people who are using alcohol also the people who are using marijuana, and vice versa? What we also know with the Healthy Youth Survey is that of the high school seniors who used alcohol in the past 30 days, 58% also reported marijuana use in the past 30 days. And 26% who used marijuana in the past month, 70% of them reported using alcohol in the past month. So what this tells us is that there is concurrent use of both alcohol and marijuana in the past month among many, many seniors in high school and among many people. What this doesn't tell us is how are they using? Are they using it on the same day? Are they using, for example, using something in the morning and something else in the evening? And it's not telling us if they're using at the same time, and it's not telling us if they're using completely different days. I use alcohol on a Friday and I use marijuana on Saturday and Sunday. I'm particularly interested in simultaneous use of alcohol and marijuana. And what I'm going to call it SAM, just for short, because it's long to say that over and over. But what I mean here is the simultaneous use, so that's using at the same time, so the effects are overlapping. This is a little bit of dated research from Monitoring the Future, but estimates in 2011 show that among the 23% of the national high school seniors who did the survey who used marijuana, 62% reported using SAM at least once in the past year, and that 13% report using SAM most or every time. So again, there is a significant, a large portion of these seniors who are engaging in simultaneous use of both alcohol and marijuana. I was part of a team that looked at patterns of SAM use, alcohol use, and marijuana use, also using the Monitoring the Future, so looking at over 80,000 seniors from the 1970s all the way until 2016. When we classify people in terms of their alcohol use, in the past year alcohol use, their binge drinking, their marijuana use in the past year, recency of marijuana use in the past month, and whether they engaged in SAM use at all in the past month or not. When we did a latent class analysis, we found 4 different kind of patterns or classes of use, and you can see here at the bottom right corner that over 50% only used alcohol. Didn't use marijuana, didn't use engage in SAM use. We see about 11% who kind of were in this concurrent user group that used marijuana and used alcohol, but they didn't SAM. They're not engaging in binge drinking. I think the more interesting things are the 2 top ones, where we have 2 different classes of SAM users. We have a lighter SAM using group, which is about 22%. They used SAM without binge drinking, but they were using marijuana in the past month. And then we have what we call a heavier using group, about 11%, that report simultaneous use, but also with binge drinking, and the binge drinking is in the last 2 weeks, as well as recent marijuana use. And so I think this highlights that, it's important to look at alcohol and marijuana and how people are using these, to include frequency. And this is just kind of also a very cursory view of things. And so that's interesting to me. So why does this matter? Why does SAM use matter? There's been research to show that just comparing people who engage in SAM use versus those who don't, or just those who drink alcohol versus others who engage in SAM, that substance-related legal, academic, interpersonal, physical and mental health problems are greater for those who engage in SAM use, as well as the incidence of traffic accidents are higher among those with SAM use than not with SAM use. In some other studies that we have done with young adults who report SAM use at least in the last month, we decided to look at these just retrospectively, it's cross-sectional, but we decided to ask, so how clumsy do you typically feel when you typically use alcohol? How clumsy do you typically feel when you use just marijuana? And how clumsy do you typically feel when you use alcohol and marijuana at the same time? This is just very kind of descriptive, but what we found was that among these young adults who did engage in SAM use, the SAM effects were greater for all of the ones compared to alcohol or marijuana only. So that's interesting, and I think thinking about the clumsy, confused, dizzy, and difficult concentrating, if these are the perceived effects that people are reporting when they're engaging in SAM use, this has consequences, particularly if one decides to drive, and it goes along with some of the other slides that I previously had shown. What this doesn't tell us, and what other studies that I've presented don't tell us, is they were all cross-sectional. They don't really tell us how does individuals' behavior differ from one day to another. How, when someone engages in SAM use, are they actually at personal greater risk on that day than they might be on a different day when they're only drinking alcohol or only using marijuana? So coming back to Seth, if we just added a few words to his thing, it increases, at least to me, the interest of the statement. So just saying UW is conducting a study to determine marijuana smokers are more or less likely to drink alcohol on days they use marijuana at the same time. So this also might get at some of the questions about the substitution or complementary effects in a little bit of a different way. So we have a study called Project SAM that we currently are running, and I'll tell you a little bit about this, but it's with a local young adult, 18 to 25 in the local area. And we're recruiting frequent drinkers, those who drink at least 3 times a month, and who report engaging in SAM use at least once in the past month. And we're really interested in seeing how their behavior differs day to day. So we get a look within person, and as well as differences between people with this type of design. We call it kind of a measurement burst daily diary design. We are assessing every person 14 days, 2 times a day for 14 days. They do these 14-day bursts 6 times across 2 years. And they answer questions about their substance use, the consequences that they may be experiencing, both positive and negative consequences, kind of what's going on in their life that day, and various other things. So just some preliminary descriptive stuff. Now ignore those numbers. I apologize. The numbers are wrong. The bars are correct, but just taking a look, I'm going to present data from 134 people who have complete 2-week data. The total number of reported days we have is 1,723. So just looking across all of the reported days that we have, about 30% of all days include neither alcohol nor marijuana use. We have about 16% that were alcohol-only days, 30% that were marijuana-only days, 7% that were of days that had both alcohol and marijuana use, but not simultaneous use. And it was about 17% that have SAM, that were characterized as SAM use days. So the interesting thing here is we can compare the days when people engaged in SAM use and compare that to all other alcohol days. And what we find when we do that with multi-level models, we find that there is increased drinking on those SAM days in terms of number of drinks and in terms of perceived intoxication. So for example, on SAM days, there was an 18% increase in number of drinks compared to all other alcohol days. We see the same pattern for marijuana days, in that there was more marijuana use measured in terms of grams used, the number of hours high, and perceived intoxication. All of these were significantly different and higher on SAM days compared to other marijuana using days. Why this matters, implications for public health. So the preliminary evidence is that on SAM days, we see complementary effects. We see greater alcohol and marijuana use compared to, say, someone's typical or average use across those 14 days. When they engaged in the SAM use, we saw higher alcohol and higher marijuana use on those days when they were used simultaneously. I'm not really going to go into this, but we also assess, like I said, positive and negative consequences. So some positive things, perceived positive things. I felt good. I became more social. Negative things, hangovers, other types of things. Across people, we see that more frequent SAM users have increased likelihood of negative alcohol-related consequences. I think an interesting thing is here that they're also reporting more positive consequences on SAM days. I have 2 minutes, I'm gonna hurry up. Another thing to think about, most young adults who are using marijuana are also drinking alcohol. From the slide I showed with the patterns of the different classes, not all SAM users are the same, and we can't just assume that all SAM users are really heavy users. They're binge drinking all the time. There's a lot of variation there. And I might actually suggest that they're both high risk, but I think paying a particular attention to the lighter class would be important. And I wonder, could they even be at greater risk on SAM occasions? From the alcohol research that we do, I have found that that typically lighter drinkers, when they do drink at a higher level than they normally do, they are at greater risk of experiencing negative consequences than do the heavier drinkers. And so I wonder how that might play out with SAM use. Moving forward, it would be very interesting to look at long-term impact of SAM use, including behavioral and driving consequences, sexual risk-taking. We do have these measures, and we will be looking at them 1, 2, and 3 years post those time points to see what the long-term risks of SAM use are. And how are substance use patterns changing among teens and young adults? So national data from Monitoring the Future is showing that drinking, binge drinking, high-intensity drinking, and other drug use are going down slightly, whereas marijuana use is maintained, it's pretty stable or maybe increasing slightly. So this is really interesting to me. What we don't know is how SAM use is changing over time, what those trends are. And I'm actually wondering whether people might be substituting binge drinking and the high intensity drinking for SAM use. So that's something that I think would be really interesting to take a look at. And then prevention targets, specifically, what are the thinking about the motivations that people are using and engaging in SAM use. Some of the research that we have done has shown that there are specific motivations for SAM use above and beyond motivations that people have for alcohol or marijuana independently. And some of those are for coping reasons, social reasons, conformity reasons, as well as sorry, I was thrown by the zero now, as well as thrown for the increased intoxication. And in fact, this increased intoxication is one of the most reported reasons for using SAM. And so in light of they're wanting to become more intoxicated, and they're saying that they're becoming more intoxicated, I think it is really interesting and really some place for us to think about how we would use that in prevention. As always, it takes a village to do research, and I want to thank all the wonderful people that I work with and the teams that I work with here at UW and at the University of Michigan, and for NIAAA for supporting my research. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine. This would be a good time to pull out your cellular device and send text messages to us about questions you might have. Next, we're going to hear a little bit, we're going to switch from marijuana and alcohol a little bit to cannabis and tobacco. And we're really privileged to have Gillian Schauer joining us today to talk about her work. And Dr. Schauer is a senior policy fellow with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Foundation and a senior consultant with the Office on Smoking and Health at the Center for Disease Control. And her research primarily focuses on marijuana policy, co-use of marijuana and tobacco cessation, and health systems transformation. And if you want to hear more about her great work or see more, make sure to read about it. And thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. And I also have a University of Washington affiliation as a clinical instructor. So for those of you who don't know, the CDC Foundation is actually not a federal agency. It's a nonprofit foundation, and we help extend the work that CDC does. And CDC is not congressionally authorized or and does not have budget to work on marijuana policy and prevention. So a lot of that work funnels through me. So my obligatory disclosure that these are my opinions and don't represent any opinions of any of the agencies I work with. So I'm really here today to talk less about an individual scientific study and more about a body of scientific work that shares some of the overlap between cannabis and tobacco, and really some of the main reasons that those of you who work in tobacco should care about marijuana legalization and vice versa. So before I talk about the areas of overlap and the similarities, I would be remiss if I didn't first talk about some of the differences. And doing a lot of work in the field for this topic, I'm often told by people, oh, well, isn't marijuana just like tobacco, or isn't it just like alcohol or opiates? Sadly, I don't have time to walk you through this entire slide, but I wanted to start by talking about important ways that tobacco and marijuana are different. The rest of the presentation focuses on the similarities, so I'll skip that. So I think tobacco, there are really no accepted medical uses for commercial tobacco, and that's a difference, as we've just heard from the prior panel, with marijuana. While both nicotine and THC are psychoactive, tobacco is not impairing like marijuana is, so that's another big difference. The addiction potential with tobacco at this point in time, or with nicotine, I should say, is much, much higher than we see with marijuana. That may not always be the case with some of the high concentrate products, but for now, nicotine is much more addicting, and nicotine carries a much greater morbidity and mortality than we see. So those are important things I want you to keep in the back of your mind as I talk about the areas of overlap. These are different substances. We should not put marijuana in any of these boxes. It's different. It has overlaps with all of these substances. So ways that they overlap and reasons that that tobacco control should care about marijuana and vice versa. Number one is the population, and co-use of cannabis and tobacco is very common. There are a number of ways that this can happen. Marijuana or cannabis and tobacco can be co-administered in the same product. So there are blunts, which are hollowed out cigar wrappers, which do still contain nicotine, that are filled with marijuana. There are spliffs, which are basically marijuana cigarettes that combine cannabis and tobacco. And increasingly, we see in qualitative work that people are looking at a lot of different ways to combine these substances. Another type of co-use is concurrent use, where they're used at the same time, but not in the same product. So somebody might have an hour-long bong session and they're smoking a cigarillo while they're also alternating and smoking a bong. Sequential use is the next way. That's where somebody might consume their marijuana and follow it up by consuming some tobacco. Documented in the literature are patterns like chasing or boosting, where people will consume cannabis, often through a blunt, and follow it up by use of a cigarette or cigarillo. I'll talk a little later about why they might be doing that. Sadly, all that our surveillance often allows us to see is use in the same month. We really can't tell, are people using it at the same time? So what do we know about that? Well, when we look at adult past month marijuana users, the blue line, we see that there is a lot of overlap. Almost 70% of adults with past month marijuana use have past month use of a tobacco product. Now, the universe of tobacco users is much larger. At this point, the prevalence of tobacco use in our country is still much higher than marijuana. So it's a little less overlap there. If you're looking at the denominator being tobacco users, that's your universe. About 18% have past month use of marijuana. So what are they using? You can see this compares past month marijuana users to non-past month marijuana users. You can see past month marijuana users much more likely to use cigarettes and cigars. About 60% are using cigarettes, 20% are using cigars. And you can see that 42% of people who reported that they had past month marijuana use had used a blunt, which is a combination tobacco marijuana product. And a lot of people don't understand that that product also has nicotine. And then a lot of poly tobacco use. So they're using tobacco in a variety of ways. When we look at youth, I think the most important takeaway from this slide is that looking at patterns of tobacco and cannabis use in youth, the most predominant pattern now are youth who use both. That is a more dominant pattern than youth who are only using marijuana and youth who are only using tobacco. So the next way that they overlap, or the reason that this overlap matters, is there's overlapping methods of use and products. So both of these substances are still primarily consumed in smoked form, despite the fact that we have lots of different products in Washington state. Vaping is on the rise, both for nicotine and for cannabis. And heat not burn technologies are also on the rise. They've been around for cannabis for some time now, and they're often referred to as dry herb vaping, and they're coming for nicotine. So one of the challenges, I think, is that products increasingly look similar. So I would challenge any of you to look at that bottom picture of all of the electronic vaping devices and tell me which ones are used for cannabis and which ones are used for nicotine. They look the same. Increasingly, we also see companies playing in both spaces. So PAX produces a USB-like vaping device, and they now also produce Juul, which is a tobacco device that's appearing in schools a lot. And increasingly, we see cannabis products starting to model themselves more on cigarettes. So these are all real pictures that I have taken in the field of cigarette-looking products that are actually cannabis. So the challenges with that are for our surveillance systems. If we're asking about types of product use, we may not really know what people are using that device for. For policy and enforcement, it's going to become increasingly hard to know, are people vaping cannabis or are they vaping nicotine? And the health harms at this point are very different. And then for messaging and public education, which I'll talk a little bit about. The third way that they overlap, or reason we should care, is compounding health effects. So what are the health effects if you're using both cannabis and nicotine? And I wish I could talk a lot more about the health effects of cannabis, but I don't have time, so I'm just talking about the overlap. Sadly, we do not have nearly as much information as we need about this. What we do know from a handful of studies are that use of both can exacerbate respiratory symptoms, especially if you're smoking both, can possibly compound mental health effects and cognitive development effects. And a lot of that will depend on the extent of use and the concentration of THC in the products you're using. And then, especially in smoked form, using both just presents additive risk of exposure to carcinogens. The next way they overlap is the potential impact on quitting. So THC, there's a pretty well-designed lab-based study that suggests that THC and nicotine interact to enhance the rewarding effects and make use of both together more pleasurable, which is why we might see people seeking to use them together. That, in theory, can make quitting harder. At this point, there's stronger evidence that using both will make quitting cannabis harder. There's not as much conclusive evidence that using both will make quitting nicotine harder. That, of course, would be very concerning, again, because we know the harms of nicotine. I'm also personally interested, but have not found the right surveillance system to investigate the role of menthol. So we know that menthol makes quitting cigarettes and nicotine much harder, and we're starting to see menthol in combination products, in blunt wraps, for example, and increasingly even in some of the hash oils. So what would be the impact of having double consumption of menthol, if you will? And we really don't have a good sense of whether or not using both substances is going to cue somebody for relapse or substitution. So might it be that somebody says, I want to quit nicotine, I'm going to use cannabis, and the hand-to-mouth action of smoking a joint just makes them want a cigarette. We don't have conclusive data, and that's a really important area for future research. But there's clearly something going on. So again, these are national data that look at marijuana use status by current tobacco use status, and you can see that current marijuana users have the highest prevalence of current tobacco use and the lowest prevalence of sustained or long-term cessation from cigarettes, and the converse for never marijuana users. So there's clearly a relationship. The next reason is potential impacts on smoke-free air, clean indoor air laws. So what do we know about secondhand marijuana smoke? There's limited research on the direct effect of secondhand marijuana smoke. The WHO report, which I recommend all of you read, it's a great review of the science, they found that THC has not been determined to be carcinogenic, but cannabis smoke has. And some studies are suggesting that cannabis smoke has many of the same constituents as tobacco smoke, and some, like polyaromatic hydrocarbons, in higher proportion. So the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment added marijuana smoke as a carcinogen and a reproductive toxin in 2009, and they noted 33 different carcinogens. And then ASHRAE, these are the people who tell you if your filtration system in your indoor area is actually filtering out pollutants. ASHRAE has also considered marijuana smoke to be a pollutant. So there is evidence that suggests that maybe we shouldn't dismiss marijuana smoke as being harmless. So why isn't this an easier policy decision? Why aren't we just adding marijuana to the list of, clean indoor air pollutants and adding it to our smoke-free policy? The reason I think states and localities are really pressed on this issue is there's also an equity issue. So unlike marijuana, or unlike tobacco, you can't use marijuana in a public outdoor place. So the place that people use marijuana is indoor in your home. If you are in public housing or rented housing, you can't consume smoked or in some cases, vaped marijuana. And so particularly for people who are using for medical reasons, that presents a policy conundrum, if you will. Because the science is unclear, because there are valid medical uses, this is not such a clear-cut policy issue. So all of the states that I provide technical support to are facing this issue, and nobody has a very clear or good solution. We need to protect public health. This is the biggest threat to clean indoor air that I think we've seen, but we also need to acknowledge the medical uses and the equity issue. The next reason for the overlap is potential, or the next reason we should care rather, is potential impacts on social norms and youth use. So we know that since marijuana legalization has occurred nationally and in states, we're seeing that social norms about marijuana use are changing. People are reporting easier access, but so far it's had limited impact on utilization. It's a pretty stable trend. We should not celebrate that yet. It's early and it maybe should be a declining trend, but that's good news. A lot of researchers are concerned about whether we will start to see the reverse gateway, and that is kids starting with marijuana and then moving to tobacco. So far, starting with tobacco and moving to marijuana is still the predominant pattern nationally, but we see in Black youth that there are a much higher proportion that start with marijuana and move to tobacco, and we need to pay attention to that. There's potential nicotine exposure for kids who are using these combined products like blunts and spliffs. They may not even know they're being exposed to nicotine. And I think marijuana and tobacco use together are a bit of a canary in the coal mine. So these are some unpublished data I ran from our youth behavioral risk surveillance survey. And you can see that kids who are using tobacco, or kids who are using marijuana rather, have much higher prevalence of tobacco use, poly-tobacco use, and pretty much any other substance. So it is a bit of a canary in the coal mine. The final area of overlap and reason we should care is the potential industry overlap. So this is a chart I really like from Bo Kilmer at RAND that just shows the range of policy options that we could have selected for legalizing cannabis. And we have selected so far in every state that has voted on it or legalized legislatively a pretty commercial model. And there are a lot of other models that we could have selected. This commercial model has things that make it analogous to big tobacco. So advertising so far for cannabis is largely unregulated. You'll see the two images with cartoons in them. Those are from California, and those are out in the field right now. Products and packaging that appeal to youth are pervasive, and states are working, especially this state, really hard to try to get that under control. But again, it's a commercial industry. Harm reduction language also abounds. So this stop smoking, start vaping is from HempFest a couple years ago, and we see that same kind of language in the tobacco industry. We don't yet know if vaping cannabis is safer than smoking cannabis. We don't have good information on any of the comparative uses. So that harm reduction language is certainly not coming from research. And then similar marketing and point of sale issues. So trusted spokespeople, daily deals like a $5 edible, and really branding to sell this in a commercial way, which is certainly different than considering medical use of cannabis. So the big question I get as well is, will big tobacco and big marijuana merge? I think it's telling that I have a number of people every year who send me this image of this Marlboro like joint package and think that it's real. So you can see my disclaimer, this is not a real product. But I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility. So at this point, federal prohibition and state laws are preventing big tobacco from really having a monetary reason to enter this arena, but the big tobacco industry has long been interested in marijuana. We have evidence from the Truth Initiative Tobacco Documents Library. And there's a lot of current activity in this space. So Imperial Tobacco changed their name to Imperial Brands and appointed a Canadian supplier of cannabis extracts to their board. Alliance One International Tobacco Company just acquired a major stake in 2 Canadian cannabis companies. And Philip Morris International has bought some specific non-GMO cannabis strain patents. So some activity that, again, I think as a research and public health community warrants monitoring. So the major takeaways on this overlap, I would say, there's a major overlap in terms of population. And if you're working with a population of tobacco users, you should be concerned about cannabis use. If you're working with a population of cannabis users, you should be very concerned about tobacco use. Co-use has implications for health, potentially for addiction and cessation. The product mode of use overlap is going to present a lot of challenges, especially for enforcing tobacco control policies. And then marijuana use has potential implications, particularly in youth, for social norms about smoking and vaping. It's a risk to smoke-free clean indoor air laws, and that's sort of an unresolved policy issue. So directions for moving forward, we certainly need more information on co-use in a lot of areas, particularly health effects, impact on subsequent tobacco use in youth who are co-using and may not even know it, implications for cessation, health effects of secondhand smoke and aerosol. We certainly need to continue good surveillance on both of these substances, and I would argue in both youth and adults. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, tobacco and cannabis are different, and we need to recognize that. There are areas of tobacco control policy that can be useful for us when we think about cannabis policy. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Again, this is a good time to enter your questions. I just noticed you missed something here at the bottom of this slide. It says, together our impact is greater. You know, tobacco and cannabis together. I just wondered if that was intentional or not, but thought I would point that out. So to wind us up this afternoon, we get to hear again from Bia Carlini. And we heard earlier, Bia was announced earlier, but I would say that in 2016, she was appointed to coordinate marijuana research activities at ADAI. And it's been my real privilege to be working with her in that approach at ADAI. And the thing I've appreciated so much about working with Bia is her strong, sincere belief in science and letting the science lead the way rather than, what are the made-up facts called? Whatever we're living under now. Anyway, fake news, yeah. And I just wanted to take this opportunity, since we've already heard her introduction, to thank Bia for all the work she did in collaborating and coordinating this work together for us today, but also all the staff at ADAI, Nancy and Jennifer, everyone who's worked on this so much. I don't know everyone, but I just want to acknowledge them and take a minute to applaud them, and Dennis for the work that you guys have all done. And so that's how I'm introducing you, Bia, because Bia is going to be talking to us now a little bit about the thing I think a lot about is opiates and marijuana. So, your turn.
That was a very kind introduction and also a very appropriate reminder. That was Danny thing. He would thank the staff, and but I want to thank in behalf of ADAI. It's just been, I mean, I just feel like hugging everybody after. But I won't have time. I'm traveling to Brazil. And don't count my time on this, okay? Just start counting when I'm talking. Otherwise, I'm not going to thank you. Oh, I'm fine. Okay. Okay, so that being said, let's get to work. So I'm talking about the elephant in the room, and first I want to tell you who is in the room with the elephant in my talk. So I'm talking about the public health community here, which, by the way, I belong to. And let's see who is the elephant. So the elephant is the statement that the cannabis may have a role in curbing the opioid epidemic. We don't want to talk about that. We have not been talking about that. We actually are leaving the room fast when somebody suggests that. It's been a struggle to have a voice over this topic in the public health community. I think there is a reason for that. There are many reasons. I don't know all of them. But for certain, we come from an environment, the public health environment, where substances are always surrounded by risk messages. So it's all about why you should not use, what how you should think more about using. And a lot of us were not born and, as professionals working in the field of cannabis. We kind of migrated for many circumstances to this field, and we carry with us the message we were trained on, that is, don't use, it's dangerous, don't go there, avoid the most that you can. And now we are having a product that has a different tone to it because it's way more complex. It has an important side of the potential therapeutic effects, and particularly for pain, that we are very confused what to do with that. There are other reasons too. Historically, the funding for public health messages and for public health research has been around issues of risks. And the concern with the most vulnerable after the legalization also put us in even more, our radars even more in tune with emphasizing the risk. So meanwhile, while we are silent, the rest of the world is not. Yay, Rolling Stones, CNBC, High Times, but if you think that's not major enough, let's go to Scientific American and the Conservative America. There is a lot of claims. If you are living in this world for the last year and care to ever look at the news, you probably have bumped with some of these claims. We are silent, the world is not. So in this presentation, my hope is to invite the public health community to break the silence and go forward and have a message, particularly about the intersect about opioid, pain, and cannabis. I'm trying to use here the idea of upstream and downstream, and the first topic that I'm gonna explore with among the many topics you have and questions in the interface of cannabis and opioids and pain is, are cannabis effective for chronic pain? And there was already addressed here. I'm gonna address in a different way with trying to bring to a public health response. And the other one is downstream. So the upstream is people haven't even start using opioid yet. Would cannabis be a better option? And the downstream is cannabis is not being used. What has been used is the standard of care, opiate, and the person is using heavily. Could cannabis have a role on helping people to quit or to avoid or prevent dose escalation? So let's look a little bit about the research evidence around this and trying to see if we can say something from a public health perspective. So I think a lot of us are familiar that in December of 2017, a 400-page document was put together and published as a result of a work of a nationally hired handpicked committee to review all the literature when it comes to cannabis health effects, both positive and negative. The National Academy of Cannabis is a big deal. When you have something published from this organization, formerly named Institute of Medicine, this is a moment that scientists pause and reframe their messages. It's that powerful. Their conclusion in terms of chronic pain, looking at 28 good quality randomized trials in people, was that there is a strong conclusive evidence that cannabis is effective for treatment of chronic pain. Interesting enough, I thought the world would change that day and we would start talking different about this issue. No, we didn't, no. No, the elephant continued to be in the room. And I want to explore a little bit what I think that is. So there are two qualifiers that the Institute of Medicine or the National Academy of Medicine clearly pointed out, saying first, it's conclusive and it's strong, but the effects are modest. And the studies were done mostly with nabiximols. And everybody's like, nabiximol, is this even cannabis? So let's explore this a little bit. So first, is modest effect good enough, and compared to what? So is that enough for us not changing our language? So we have to compare, for instance, with the evidence that is out there for opioids used as for chronic pain. I'm not talking about acute pain. Nobody's going to beat opioid for acute pain. But when you think on more than 3 months and under, like chronically, CDC has released their prescribing opioids for chronic pain based on a very rigorous literature review that would show what is available to guide the thing. And what they really showed is that, surprisingly for me certainly, that mostly what you have for chronic pain and opioids are observational studies or randomized controlled trials with very notable limitations, different from the other ones, the 28 selected with good quality ones according to the selection in the criteria of the National Academy of Science. No studies had a follow-up of more than a year. No studies had the 3 outcomes important to study pain, that is pain, function, and quality of life. So really, effect models effect that have strong evidence is not something that we can lightly disregard. Yet we are disregarding. What about nabiximols? Well, nabiximol is actually cannabis in the other side of the pond. This is a European product. Is cannabis. It's a herbal preparation. Is a standard THC plus CBD, have all the elements of the plant. Is a spray, just a little spray you put under your tongue. And I wouldn't say we are really in the cutting edge of using this medication. It's commercially available actually in way more than these countries, but I thought that these countries in Europe were more convincing than me telling you that it's now approved in Brazil, for instance. I'm a little biased for that. So, so anyway, this is a very well-controlled cannabis product that by no means is something just because it have a fancy name, a chemical that is not a plant. Yet we haven't changed our language. What about the other question, the downstream questions? Can cannabis be used as a substitute for opioid-based medications? Very preliminary research. There is research out there? Yes. Basically, they are compounded by surveys of people, big surveys, thousands of people saying, it helped me. I got off opioids, or I decreased my opioids, or I start combining with cannabis and my pain decreased and I have a better quality of life. There is one longitudinal study when they get people right when they get their certificate or their license to use medicinal cannabis and follow them for 21 months. This is like a 50 people study, but also shows even if you follow them, which is a little methodologically a little stronger data, that there is some effect. This is limited for reasons that we are just talking to the people that it worked. And these are the people that are willing to take cannabis. They are self-reporting for us, so this is what they attribute their changes to. And as scientists, we are just observing from outside. So it's very different from the upstream question, that is the effectiveness for treating chronic pain. The good news is, and the good news unfortunately comes from Colorado and not from Washington State at this point, that there are a true randomized trial happening right now. They are recruiting. If you are interested, go to Colorado, you may get in. So it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study that compares the analgesic power of oxycodone and compared to cannabis and also to a placebo. And really try to determine how they compare hand in hand. So this is one study still being conducted, but we see with a lot of enthusiasm that what the patients are reporting are being investigated further in a more rigorous process. That was funded by University of Colorado with tax money from the marijuana legalization, is not from the federal government. So public health summary, and this is my invitation, and by the way, this is my story. If the press calls me, that's what I'm saying. Just like I did in NPR another day, I was like, what did you hear that I said again? For the people that had the chance to listen to me. So I think we have the public duty to give a science-based but also politically informed response to this question. And my response is cannabis and cannabinoids are effective for chronic pain. It's moderate, but moderate is not a small thing. And the caveat is a political caveat. The caveat is that most of the research that is conducted, unfortunately, is an extract that is not available here. And the extracts that are available here, and believe me, I have people calling and contacting ADAI in certain regularities saying, please can you test our product? And we are forbidden to test the products that are available for consumption. I would also say that cannabis may help to reduce circuit opioids taken to control pain in the real world, and animal studies may show that, but at this point is not a public health message yet. It's something that has to be resolved with a healthcare provider. Why this matter? I think the public health implications of the silence that we are in are very risky. We are basically delivering, when we are talking about the risk, they are real, a one-sided message, and that jeopardizes the credibility of our message altogether. The other is the invalidation of the people that suffer from chronic pain. We are pretty much making their statement look like this is an excuse to get stoned, and this got away. This has got to stop. This is not honest. And I think we have to at least recognize there is something serious on their claims, and more studies are needed. And third is the silence makes the only voice of this debate the industry. So I'm showing here two industry billboards, and frankly, it's the first time I see billboards with a reference from JAMA and the PubMed reference. So they have a reference. So they are interpreting our science made with public money to deliver the message of the industry. Well, I have no judgment. It's a free country. You can say what you want, and we are not going to have billboards. But I think not getting our voice, we are giving the monopoly of the interpretation of this data to just one sector. Moving forward, we as a public health community have to acknowledge that this is not everything or nothing. This is a very complex topic. We have to qualify. The only statement we so far have been making when somebody really presses, we kind of mumble, there's not research enough, and just leave the room really fast. We have to be brave and say more. And we have to recognize that, who the people that claim that it works for them, it probably works for them. We have to distinguish our public health voice from the voice of the marijuana industry. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bea. It was great to see all the questions you had in your presentation. Because we had a little question snafu. If you sent a question and they actually got deleted, so resend it to me now, and it should be in your text confirmations. For some reason, they disappeared. But we do have a few to start with, so I'm going to invite the panelists to come forward and oh, yes, this was one that I did remember. And this is a question for you, Christine, about, are you concerned about your use of the acronym SAM could be confused with the hysterical group Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM?
I wasn't.
You're being very succinct. Okay, next question. I think it's an interesting thing. Have you seen their Smart Approaches to Marijuana website?
I briefly a few months ago when this did come up. I think we are in recruitment phase right now. We haven't, to my knowledge, had people come up and ask us questions about that. But it's an interesting idea, and one to think more about the implications of what that might be.
Someone else said that there's kind of the thought, or you hear a lot, that marijuana is safer than alcohol. Some industry promotes that, those kinds of things. I wonder if you could kind of collectively kind of comment on that. How true is that?
Can you put my slide back up? Just kidding. No, I'm kidding. You don't have to do that. I think it depends on what harms you're talking about. If you're talking about morbidity and mortality, certainly I would say tobacco is the worst. Opiates and alcohol are somewhere in the middle. Opiates are getting a lot of attention right now, but they still don't have as many deaths per year as tobacco. And marijuana doesn't have a lot of deaths, but I don't think that should be the only marker of harm. Some of you might be wondering why I said marijuana has no deaths. It does cause acute psychotic episode, and there have been some documented cases where that resulted in death, particularly in Colorado. So I would want more detail on exactly what harms. I also think that because of the lack of research that we've been able to conduct on marijuana, which all of the speakers today talked about, we may well not know the potential risks and how to protect against those for marijuana. And so we need to continue researching marijuana in the ways that we have been able to research tobacco and increasingly alcohol and opiates.
This one? Yeah. I think this question is, it kind of assumes we have a choice that we're gonna, in the real world, select one over another, which it may happen for a lot of individuals, but that's not as it happens as a society. In general, as you saw for the data, people are overlapping the use, making the this kind of question a little out of place for me. When it comes for the medicinal purpose, I think it's completely different. Then yes, you are talking about how can you treat one thing with a better medication than the other, was less combined, have less side effects. This is a totally different question. I think the better than, it depends how you use, how much you use, when you use, and most people don't just use one substance.
Can I add one more thing? I don't want to be an alarmist at all, because I am actually very neutral on this topic, and I see potential harms and I see potential benefits, and our job is to protect against the harms. I think because we have legalized this in a commercial way, we could see the potential harms from cannabis change in the commercial marketplace. And so the cigarette-like products that I showed, one of those, I happen to be in a store, and I always, I go in once a month to sort of see what's new, and I saw this product that looked just like a cigarette, and I asked the store owner, can you tell me more about this? I haven't seen this before. And he said, the rep for the product is in the room. You should talk to the rep. And so I always disclose that I'm a researcher and kind of leave it at that unless they ask for more. And so the rep said, this is a great new product that's meant to be used on like a cigarette break, and it's lower THC, and so you could go downstairs and smoke this 15% THC joint and go right back up to your office and have increased focus. And the caution that I would give is, if we see the industry start to move to cigarette-like products that people are smoking around the clock throughout the day, we likely will see the health harms change. And so I think that's another duty that we have as researchers and public health stewards, is to sort of watch what the industry is doing and study that so we know the harms.
Thanks.
Logic of the legalization that we have, that is a profit, market-oriented legalization, independently of the very good intentions of a lot of local business here that I have my deepest respect, the logic of the industry as a system is to produce profits. And when it's to produce profits, there's nothing about substitution. It's really about combination. Our industry is gonna invest the money where it makes sense. If the competition is big, you just put the one or two or three more substances together. So that's the cross investment is gonna grow.
Christine, there's several questions in here around the idea of evidence around order, around getting drunk and using marijuana next, using marijuana first and getting drunk later. Some ask about crossfading and what that is. Can you talk a little bit more just generally around your SAM and what the order is? And then there's some also questions around, does dose matter? Like, the THC level or the kind of booze you're drinking, like if you're drinking beers or drinking hard liquor. So there's questions about that. I know that's a lot, and you could probably take our whole time, but if you have any kind of insights.
Those are great questions and ones that I'm very interested in, and ones that we are hoping to look at in our study. We do, let me start with the idea of crossfading. We have a paper that actually just a few days ago was accepted, where we asked qualitatively among young adults, have you heard of the term of crossfading? What does it mean to you? What the perceived harm is of that, or the perceived risk? Most young adults know and have heard of the term crossfading. We asked them to define it. It's using alcohol and marijuana at the same time, or some version of that idea, being drunk and high at the same time. We coded in all those specific words. So essentially, for the teens and young adults, they are using the term crossfading, and that's what that means to be kind of intoxicated or high on both at the same time. The idea of what comes first, I think, is really interesting. I don't know that we know a lot about that. We have done qualitative interviews with young adults, and we just qualitatively ask them, so this isn't, hasn't been coded, this is not published, but just anecdotally what we hear is that people use in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different motivations. So you'll have some folks will say, I'll drink and then I'll use marijuana to offset the negative effects of alcohol. And then you'll have other people who say, well, I'll use marijuana at home and then I'll go out and drink. And so I think that really understanding the motivations and the sequencing would be really important. In the study, the daily diary study that I had described, we are asking about when they're using, what they used first. We're asking about if they know the THC level, what was the THC level, as well as the CBD level. We've just added that in there, as well as what did you drink and the alcohol content of that drink. So hopefully, in a couple of years, we'll have that answer for you.
Okay, thanks so much. So a lot we still don't know, and one of the questions that came up is a little bit more about the fact that there's another elephant in the room on how are we going to encourage rescheduling cannabis so much needed research can be conducted. Oh, you're going to answer this. I'm so glad. You have an answer?
No, I don't have an answer, but I do have some caveats. So I think the problem that has been highlighted today by researchers is that the scheduling is precluding us from conducting the research that we need. And even federal agencies are on record saying that that is indeed a problem. I would caution about just saying we need to reschedule without thinking that through. So if we reschedule from 1 to 2, 2 means that then it's being given out in pharmacies. And so what are the implications of that? I actually don't think the industry wants that. If we unschedule it, that has other challenges. So I really think we need to be clear that we're talking about a change in scheduling for research purposes. And maybe that ends up being a carve out. I mean, I'm not going to pontificate on the policy solution there, but I think we need to be clear that the problem is with research.
Thanks for that clarification. So there was a question about, there's several questions about driving, and the Washington State Traffic Commission kind of identified that marijuana and alcohol, the SAM, and driving together is very risky, much more risky than marijuana alone. And there's some Australian studies, an Australian study that shows that marijuana drivers have lower risk associated with marijuana than alcohol. And the question is for you, Gillian, about how hopeful are you that education might help DUI risk decrease risks if marijuana were used instead of alcohol?
I think maybe Christine is going to be better able to respond to that. I don't play a lot in the alcohol space. I mean, I do know that the research supports what you suggested, that marijuana and alcohol together appear to have worse risk, but I'm...
Quite frankly, it scares me because the combination is so fatal compared to either one alone. And I don't think we've gotten the word out in a public health way that the combination of marijuana and alcohol are potentially fatal in relation to driving.
And there have also been some surveillance issues with that as well, because when we don't have a roadside test for marijuana impairment, and so when people are stopped, often if they blow a .08, they don't even test further than that. So I know that's an issue that states and federally has been talked about. But Christine, I'm sure you have opinions.
Much more to add to that. We will be looking at driving risk in our study, but the studies that are out there, including some of the results from the Washington Traffic Commission, are saying that using both together do increase the risk significantly versus either one.
Yeah. Bia, someone asked this really interesting question around, is there research on using cannabis to help get people off of opiates who are using opioids due to addiction rather than for pain relief? Are we focused more on pain relief substitution before addiction may occur?
Yeah, what I presented, this is a really good question. What I presented was really about using opioids for pain so you heard. But so what about street opioids and people that are already addicted? A student of medicine, Emily, Florin, and I worked together on a lit review of what is available and how the outcomes for people that are in treatment or people in the community that are in treatment for opioid use disorder, mostly heroin, use marijuana, and what are the benefits. We look at 1,000 papers and found 23, and even the 23, typically what happened is there is a study on opiates, and then people say, hey, is everybody talking about marijuana? That looks how our marijuana data says. And then they reanalyze, but it wasn't designed for it. Making a long story short, what we have tentatively found was that people in treatment, so people in treatment for opioid use disorder that are being treated using MAT or medication-assisted treatment, when they also report using cannabis, the outcomes for treatment and recovery are worse. When they are in treatment that is abstinence-based only, or they can use antagonists like Vivitrol, they tend to have a better prognostic if they use cannabis while in this treatment. So they have higher adherence to treatment and higher abstinence rates. This is out of 23 papers, are not very good quality that we are making all this theory, but that's what it looks like. And finally, in community of street users, there are a couple of reports of people getting off heroin by transitioning to, it was work in Los Angeles basically, among the Latino community, transitioning out of heroin by using cannabis. But it's very, very tentative and is a very important question that is absolutely unexplored.
And just to chime in, the National Academies of Sciences report and some of the other good reviews that have been conducted, the WHO and Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has 2 good reviews on the health effects of cannabis. They have reached a similar conclusion when they've looked at opiates. I think this is an area, though, where we see policy is ahead of the science. So a number of states in this past legislative cycle brought up adding opiate use disorder as an indication for medical marijuana. And I would say as a researcher, we don't have the science to support that being a policy decision at this point.
So there's a question that's been raised about a recent JAMA meta-analysis showing cognitive effects of cannabis on teens only lasts for 3 days. And I haven't seen that meta-analysis. Have any of you? And do any of you have research that would say, well, that's not how I read the research?
I have not seen that paper, but again, I can speak. So it's the CDC Foundation, CDC, a couple states were sponsors of the National Academy of Sciences report, so I know that report inside and out. I can speak to what we do know about cognitive effects in youth. So it does have effects on memory, learning, and attention. In the short term, it's not clear how long term those effects are sustained, and the research that we have is generally much older. So I would be hesitant to say that any effects in youth are irreversible. We need more science there.
More science. Yeah. Okay, good. That's why we're here. Yeah, so there's a couple questions just around the nomenclature of how we talk about things. We've talked a lot about medical marijuana, and then what does that have to do with non-medical use, or what some call recreational use? I tend to try not to use the word recreation because tennis is recreation, running is recreation, drinking is not. Marijuana use is not, and so I think just moving that out of our nomenclature could be a really important thing, to not talk about recreational marijuana use. But even changing the nomenclature around medical use to cannabis, or what are they calling it in Europe? What's that European thing they call? Yeah.
It's a botanical extract. It's cannabis, as I say, the European name, but it's only used medical. It's a spray. It's hard to have fun with a spray, really. But I don't know, just saying.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And because it has the same rate of CBD and THC, the high of the THC that is associated with what is described as fun is pretty much tamed by the high presence of CBD. So CBD has a lot of medical properties, but also has this ability to dump, to make the effect of THC high way less pronounced.
So even thinking about just changing the way they've changed the name away from marijuana or cannabis.
You kind of have to. No, so even if you look at, we have 2 FDA-approved medications here in this country that are semi-synthetic and synthetic THC, which is always good to remember for, there is also this narrative now that THC doesn't have any medical purpose. It's just CBD, which is definitely not accurate, and the only 2 medications we have approved are THC only. So they also, as Marinol and Cisamet, they have different names too. Nabinol, and I can't remember the other name. So I think it's a requirement from when you are developing medication to have a name that nobody can pronounce or understand, because it makes look, I don't know. I'm not in this area, but it's never called cannabis.
I can comment a little on marijuana versus cannabis. So in the US, I think we use them interchangeably, and for surveillance purposes, sadly, marijuana is the more widely understood. And I say sadly because if you look at the history, we actually called the plant cannabis until the early 19th century, when the Mexican Revolution happened and Mexican immigrants came across the border, and marijuana was their word for cannabis. And marijuana became a derogatory term tied up in a debate about immigration. So I think people who know that history try to deliberately use cannabis. I try to be faithful to the surveillance system because I work a lot in surveillance. And like I said, there are a number of people who still don't know that cannabis is marijuana. And so I think we'll probably slowly in time see a move towards cannabis being the more dominant term. And that's what is used predominantly in Europe, I would say.
Yeah, and it gets even more difficult because some states have actually amended their constitutions that actually have the word marijuana in it, so that they can't actually use cannabis because it's in their constitution as marijuana.
Right.
I think it's Alaska and Colorado, I think.
Yeah, Colorado is constitutional.
Yeah, can I just end? Sorry. We thought a lot about the name of this symposium, for instance, and we decided to keep marijuana as the name because we felt that we would feel like we are the researchers and the academicians above what people actually call what is being used. I also like, as an immigrant and from Latino descent myself, I also like this movement of reclaiming what is sometimes used as derogatory and just reclaiming, using and embracing instead of walking away from it. So it's something that I personally don't have much problem with it, but I haven't seen social movement in this direction. I just don't think we should necessarily try to avoid what is derogatory. We can also recreate, rename, rebrand.
So there's a question, Dr. Shar, for you around, can you talk about people using cannabis to quit tobacco?
So we have some qualitative studies on that, and I actually have done some qualitative work in Washington on that. So we know that that's a practice. We don't know how prevalent that is, and sadly our surveillance systems, nationally at least, have not really asked about that. There are a couple states that have become more interested in that, so I think we'll have better data in the coming years. But we know it's happening. We don't know how effective it is. And in fact, as I suggested, it might cue relapse. People might decide when they're smoking a joint, gosh, I really just want my cigarette. We know that the cigarette is the most effective drug delivery device potentially ever invented. And so it's hard for people to quit smoking. And a hand-to-mouth cue, that's another substance, may cause them to go back. So we don't have good science on it, but certainly it's something that we hear anecdotally people are doing.
Dr. Lee, some question around the access versus choice in SAM. You know, is it just because it's convenient and accessible that's why people are co-using? Have you looked at or controlled for access, choice, and how people are co-using or not co-using?
That's an interesting question. We ask about access if folks don't use. We ask about whether they were in a situation where, say, marijuana or alcohol was available, and if so, why did they choose not to use? And so we have those questions. We haven't looked at those yet. I think that one of the questions that we will be interested in is looking at the motivations that people have leading into a substance using event, whether it's an alcohol event, a marijuana event, or a SAM event. And with the data that we have, we're going to be able to look to see whether motivations on certain days, say alcohol days, differ than on SAM days. And so I think that will be really interesting. We're not there yet with our data, but we will be able to look at that.
So you'll be able to look at both motivation, access, and actual use of multiple different, okay. And then what about gender differences? Have you looked at any gender or race differences in SAM users compared to single item users?
We just have some preliminary data run last week, and I can't remember exactly. I'm sorry.
So the answer is yes, we have. I can't tell you what they are, but okay. That's okay.
I would say that we are looking at that with the monitoring the future data. So, to be continued.
To be continued.
Sorry.
Great. For Bia, given that we now know opiates have not been fully studied for pain, and for example, NSAIDs can be more effective for back pain, should we call... Oh, it just ended. That's all I have. Huh? Oh yeah, we should... This was limited. I should have read the end of the question, but I didn't. So okay. I think we've gotten to most of our questions here. But Gillian, what are the specific areas of tobacco cessation policies that you think can really work for cannabis prevention as well? What would you apply?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we already started to hear from the question somebody asked earlier, screening for tobacco or screening for cannabis use, so you know who's using it. I think we have traditionally seen cannabis treatment be more like other substance use treatment, where it's inpatient and outpatient, and we have found population-based solutions for tobacco that I think could really be translated for cannabis. And actually, Bia, at the first marijuana symposium that ADAI had, Bia gave an excellent talk on quit lines and the application that they might have for cannabis. So I think if we are going to help people with their cannabis use, it needs to be not abstinence only, which is what I-502 said, and it needs to have a population-based solution like a helpline or an app or a text-based program. We can't expect people in this day and age to go sit in an office for psychotherapy, or certainly not all of them. So I would recommend looking at some of the population-based tobacco interventions and then some of the system changes around how we get clinicians to screen and refer people to some sort of population-based solution.
So you're looking, so what I was thinking about more in that question is more on the prevention upstream side, and you were looking more at the
I thought you
screening
said
and-
cessation.
Oh, no, I said prevention. I'm sorry.
One track. Love my tobacco cessation.
Yeah, but I like the cessation answer. That's great. But if we can think about the prevention as well, because I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from tobacco, and I think what do you think is transportable to cannabis from tobacco prevention?
I think a lot of it is. I've thought more about what's not transferable.
So tell us what you don't
So I
think
think
is.
for tobacco, we have a really clear science base, and people believe you when you tell them that tobacco causes X, Y, or Z disease. That's not always the most effective message with youth, but we have a science to base our messaging on. With cannabis, it's really shaky science, and Oregon, Alaska, Washington, and Colorado have all now done formative work with youth on cannabis, and in all states that work has basically shown that youth don't trust the science, and they don't want messages about the science in cannabis because they know that it's kind of unresolved.
Well, that's because they can get on the internet and find a counter hypothesis or fact.
So I would suggest that that's one way that they're dissimilar. Certainly a lot of the other prevention approaches I do think apply.
Thanks. I think that wraps up our questions, and I just want to thank our three panelists for their great presentations. And again, I want to thank our partners at WSU for their great research presentations and their collegial support of this work and working across the Cascade Mountains, and to Dennis and the ADAI crew for all your work at pulling this together. Thank you so much.
So I'm the only thing that stands between you and going home. So I also just want to make some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank the folks from UW-TV. And to let you know that the video will be made available. Also, I would encourage people to look at our Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute website. We have a website that has been in existence focusing on marijuana prior to the vote on I-502. It's learnaboutmarijuanawa.org, and you will find it as a valuable set of resources that can contribute to information relevant to parents, to teens, to adult users, to researchers, to policymakers. I also want to thank Nancy Sutherland, who is in the back, along with Bia and others. And actually, if Mike and Sharon can stand up, and Meg left, but to thank our ADAI staff, some of whom are in the back. Not only did they help make the content worthwhile, they also helped make sure the computers worked, the phone system with this new sort of adaptive process of messaging for questions and so on worked. And also Caitlin, who is working with Bia. So she's going to be helping understand better some of the marketing issues and the advertising issues around the marijuana business. So I just want to say a couple of things in closing. One, I will try to get it out again. One thing I'd like to say is, again, thanks to Mike and the colleagues and the collaborators from WSU. I mean, we've had an opportunity to work together in a variety of different settings, in a variety of different capacities across time, and marijuana now represents yet one more in which we can do that. And I think bringing together this audience and this group of speakers and the panel moderators that represent both the universities really shows the potential for that collaborative process. You know, we talked about our having this symposium, and maybe the next one would be sponsored by and hosted by WSU with us going there. You know, so it really begins to allow us to have what Neffy had talked about, what might be this cross-university bridge. And I think that's really important. The other thing I just want to reflect on briefly is the presentations today really focuses on the importance of translational research. You know, I'm a psychologist. I've done intervention work. I've done looking at predictors of outcomes in a variety of things. But to hear about some of the exciting things that rats do. When I was a clinical psychology student, actually I was an undergraduate in psychology. When I heard Michelle earlier talking about that classical condition approach, I taught my rat in the experimental psychology class how to slam dunk a marble. And somehow it doesn't seem to have the same relevance today as it did then. But I think what's important is to see, you know, the kinds of things that are coming out of the labs that are more basic science, that are beginning to allow us to target the utility of cannabinoids and marijuana and cannabis, I'll get it all right yet, as a medicinal property and a medicinal agent. And then to talk about things such as, you know, exposure therapy for PTSD and what role, you know, the cannabinoids might play in that. We're talking about a continuum of research. And I think what's nice about that is that we as two universities have expertise in both arenas. And I think what's nice about this kind of a conference, as exhibited and exemplified today, is that we can learn from one another, that we, more clinical scientists, can learn from the basic scientists and vice versa. And I think that really represents and reflects the groundwork and the foundation for the collaboration that we hope to move forward in the future. So I thank you all for being here today. I hope you've learned something. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I hope you put up with some of the puns. And I hope you have a safe, sober, drug-free weekend. Thank you.